Chapter 18 of Humorous Ghosts. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by John Smith. Humorous Ghost Stories. Selected by Dorothy Scarborough. The Ghost That Got the Button by Will Adams. One autumn evening, when the days were shortening and the darkness fell early on Hotchkiss, and the frost was beginning to adorn with its fine, glistening lace the carbine barrels of the night sentries as they walked post, Sergeants Hanson and Whitney and Corporal Whitehall had come to Stone's room after supper, feeling the need common to all men in the first cold nights of the year for a cozy room, a good smoke, and congenial companionship. The steam heat, newly turned on, wheezed and whined through the radiator. The air was blue and dense with tobacco smoke. The three sergeants reposed in restful, if inelegant attitudes, and Whitehall, his feet on the window sill and his wooden chair tilted back, was holding forth between puffs at a very battered pipe about an old colored woman who kept a little saloon in town. "So she got mad at those K Troop men," he said, "and next day when Turner stopped there for a drink, she says, 'You get out of here. You men from the arsenic with the crossbones on your caps, I ain't letting you in. But the medical corpses and the non-efficient officers, they may come in.'" The laugh that followed was interrupted by the approach of a raucous, shrieking noise that rose and fell in lugubrious cadence. "What the deuce!" exclaimed Whitehall, starting up. "That's Bill," exclaimed Stone. "Bill Sullivan. He thinks he's singing. Funny you never heard him before, kid. But then he's not often taken that way. Thank the Lord. Come in, Bill," he called, "and tell us what's the matter. You feel sick? Where's the pain?" he asked as Big Bill appeared in the doorway. "Come in, hombre, and rest yourself," invited Whitney, and hospitably handed over his tobacco pouch. "What was that tune y'all were singing out yonder?" "Thanks," responded Bill, settling down. "That there tune was 'I Wonder Where You Are Tonight, My Love.' Sounded like sister's teeth are plugged with zinc," commented Whitney. "Or looking through the knothole in Papa's wooden leg," said Whitehall. "Or he won't buy the Ashman a manicure set," added Stone. "No," reiterated Bill solemnly. "It was like I told you. I wonder where you are tonight, my love. And it's a corker, too. I seen a feller in a gold singing it in Kelly's Vaudeville Palace out to Cheyenne. Onct, first he'd sing one voice, and then she'd sing the next. He was dressed like a soldier, and while he sang they was showing tabloids of what the girl was doing behind him. And then when she sang her voice, he'd be in the tabloid, and when it got to the last voice and he was dying on a stretcher in an ambulance, everybody in the house was a-crying, so you could hardly hear her. It was great. My," continued Bill, spreading out his great paws over the radiator, "ain't this the snappy evening? Real cold. Somehow it minds me of the cold we had in China, that time of the Boxers after we'd got to the legations. The nights was cold, just like this." "Why, Bill," said Whitney, "I never knew y'all were there then. Why did you never tell us before? What were you with?" "14th Infantry," responded Bill proudly. "It's a great old regiment. Don't care if they are doughboys." "What company was you in?" inquired Hanson, ponderously, taking his pipe from his mouth and breaking silence for the first time. "J Company, same as this." At this reply Stone opened his mouth abruptly to say something, but thought better of it and shut up again. "It was blamed cold them nights a week or so after we was camped in the Temple of Agriculture. That's what they called it. I don't know why. But say, the heat comin' up from Tinston was fryin'. It was just boilin', bakin', and bubblin', worse a heap than anything we'd had in the islands. We chuckled away most every last thing on that hike but canteens and rifles. I was a darn fool thing ter do, The chucking was course, but it come out all right, 'cause extry supplies followed us up on the Pie Hole in Junks. Ain't that a funny name for a river? Pie Hole. Every time I got homesick I'd say that river, and then I'd see Hogan's Diary lunch for ladies and gents on the old Bowery, and hear the kid Mick Hogan yelling, "Draw one in the dark, white wings, let her flop, Pie Hole." Ain't it helped me a heap? Bill settled himself and stretched. "But what I really wanted to tell you's about," said he, "was something that happened one o' these here cold nights. It gets almighty cold there in September, and it was sure the spookiest show I ever seen. Even Mom Haggerty's table rappings in Hester Street never come up to it. There was 3 of us fellers who ran in a bunch them days. Me and Buck Dugan, my bunkie from the Bowery, like me, he was a corporal, and Ranch Fields, we called him that 'cause he always walked on a ranch before he come into the 14th. They was great fellers, Buck and Ranch was. Buck, now, you couldn't phase him. You couldn't never phase him. No matter what sort of job you put him up against, he'd slide through slick as a greased rat. The cap'n, he knew it too. Onct when we was fightin' and hadn't no men to spare, he'd left Buck on guard over about 25 Boxer prisoners in a courtyard, and tells him he dassn't let one escape. But Buck wants ter git into the fight with the rest of the boys, and when he finds that if he leaves them Chinoo's loose in the yard alone, they'll get out plenty quick, what does he do but tie 'em tight up by their pigtails to some posts. He knows they can't undo them tight knots backwards. Ain't no Chink would cut his pigtail if he did have a knife. He'd die first. And so Buck skidoos off to the fight, and sure enough, when the cap'n wants them Boxers, they're ready tied up and waitin'. That was his sort of gee, but he was smart. We was all right interested in them Allies, of course, and watched 'em close, but Bill says Buck ter me one night, "It's been workin' in me nut that these here fellers ain't so different from what we know already, exceptin' for their uniform and outfits. We've met 'em all before, but the Japs, why, look a here," says he. "First there's the white men, the English. Ain't they just like us, except that they're thicker and we're longer? And they're Injun niggers. Ain't we seen their clothes in the comic operas, and them without their clothes in the monkey cage at Central Park? And their Hong Kong China regiment and all the other Chinos is just the same as you meet in the pipe joints in Mott Street. Then," says he, "come all the Dagos. These leather necks of macaroni Dagos we've seen all swarming all over Mulberry Bend and Five Points. The sauerkraut Dagos looks for all the wood like they was going ter a Schützenfest up by High Bridge. The froggy Dagos you'll find packed in them Frenchy restaurants in the 30s, where yer get blue wine, and them vodka Dagos only needs a pushcart ter make yer think you're in Baxter Street." Buck, he could sure talk, but Ranch, he wasn't much on chin-chin. Little and dark and quiet he was, and just crazy for dogs. Any old mutt'd do for him, just so's it was in the shape of a pup. He was fair wild for 'em. He picked up a yaller cur out there the day after the Yankston fight, and that there no account mangy flea-bitten mutt had ter stay with us the whole time. If the pup didn't stand in me and Buck and Ranch, he swore he'd quit too. So we had to let him come, and he messed and bucked with our outfit right along. Ranch named him Daggett, after the Colonial, which was right hard on the C.O., but I bet Ranch thought he was complimentin' him. Why, Ranch considered himself honored if any of the pup's fleas hopped off on him. The pup, he kept along with us right through everything. Ranch watched him like the apple of his eye, and he hardly ever was out of our sight, till one night about a week after we quartered in the Temple he didn't turn up for supper. He was always so regular at his chow that Ranch began ter get the squirms, and when come Taps and Daggett hadn't reported, Ranch had the razzle-dazzles. Next morning the first thing he must go hunt that pup, and went a-scouting all day, me and Buck helping him, but nary pup, and come another supper without that miserable mutt, and Ranch was up and alley all. Right, all right. He was all wore out, and I made him hit the bunk early and try ter sleep, but Lord, no sooner he drop off than he get ter twitching and hitching and wake up a yelping for Daggett. Long 'bout Taps. Buck, who's been out on a private reconnaissance, comes back and whispers ter me, "Sst, Bill, the cur's found. Don't tell Ranch. The bloke died of heart failure." I struck his trail and follered it, and say, "Bill, what in your thunder do yer think them heathen Chinos has at him?" Lord, now wouldn't that jolt use? Them Chinos a-eatin' Daggett? It give me an awful jar, and Buck he felt it too, that their mutt had acted right decent, and we knew Ranch would have bats in the belfry for fair if he hold till the pups finish. So says Buck, let's not tell him, 'cause he's taking on now like he'd lost mother and father and best girl and all, and if he knew Daggett was providing chow for Chinos, he'd go clean bug house, and we'd have ter ship him home ter St. Elizabeth. I says okay ter that, and we made it up not ter let on ter Ranch, and now here comes the spook part yer been a-waitin' fer. 4 or 5 nights later I was on guard, and my post was the farthest out we'd had on the north. There was an old road out over that way, and I'd hauled till it led ter a graveyard, but I hadn't never been there myself, and hadn't that thought much about it till long between 2 and 3 o'clock, as I was a-hiking up and down, when somepin comes a-zizzin' down the road, hell for leather on to me, a-yellin' somepin fierce. Gee, but I was skeered. I made sure it was a spook, and there wasn't a bit o' breath left in me. I was all to the bad that time for sure. Before I had time ter think even, that screamin', streakin' thing was on me and a-grabbin' round my knees, and then I see it was one o' old them there Christian Chinos, and he's scared more'n me even. His eyes had popped clean out'n their slits, and his tongue was hangin' out by the roots. He was that locoed. I raised a long yell for corporal of the guard, which happened by good luck ter be Buck, and when he come a-runnin', thinkin' from the whoops I give he was bein' rushed by the whole push of boxers. The two of us began proddin' at the chink ter find out what was doin'. Took us some time, too, with him bein' in such a flutter and hardly able ter even hand out his darn old pidgin English. That sounds like language comin' out of a sausage machine. When we did savvy his line of old chop suey talk, we found out he'd seen a ghost in the graveyard, and not only seen it, but he knew who the spook was and all about him. He was gettin' some serious ourselves, and made him tell us. Seems it was a mandarin. That's a sort o' chink police court judge. Till I got ter Tinston, I always thought they was little oranges. And this Mandarin's name was Wu Ti Ming Ang. He'd been a high muckraker in his day, which was 200 or 300 years back. But the emperor caught him deep in some sort of old graft and took away his button and all of his dough. Lord, says Buck, when we come ter this, don't that prove what heathens chinks is? Only one button ter keep on their clothes with, and the emperor he can take it away. What did this here Judge Ming do then, John? Use string or pins? This here John didn't seem ter savvy, but he said that the mandarin took on so fur his button and his loss of pull in the ward that it was sure sad ter see. And by the emperor got busy again with him and had him finished up for keeps. Had him die the death of 1,000 cuts, says John. It sounded fierce to me, but Buck, he says, "Psh, anybody's been shaved regular by them lady barbers on 4th Avenue, would have give the Emperor that merry ha-ha. After Ming was cut up, they took the remains of his corpse and planted him in this here graveyard up the road. But he wouldn't stay planted and began doing stunts at night, topside, walkie-walkie, and a-hunting for his lost button. He'd used ter have the whole country scared up, but for the last 20 years he'd kept right quiet and hardly ever come out. But now, since the foreign devils come, ain't that a sweet name for us, he's up and at it again, worse than ever, and the heathens is on their ear. For 4 nights now they'd seen him, wrapped in a blue robe, waiting and hunting behind tombstones and a-walking. Round and round the graveyard lies 6 days, raced for the belt at Madison Square. John had just seen him on the wall, and that was why he come charging down the road like 40 cats. Well, Mr. Ming's spurt walk till he gets that button back? Buck asks. John says, sure. Well, says Buck, why don't yer give him one? No can give, only Emperor, only Son of Heaven give. Well, look here, says Buck, we sand rabbits ain't no sons of heaven, but I'll be darned if we couldn't spare a button ter lay the ghost of a poor busted police court judge who's lost his job and his tin. If that's all he wants back, what time does he come out at, John? Could we see him ter-morrow night? Sure could we, says John. He'll show us the way, but he won't be waiting with us. He's bad enough for his. So Buck takes John and goes back ter the guard shack, as it's most time for relief, and after I got back, we told John ter get the hook, and we talked things over. And Buck, he was just wild ter see if he couldn't lay that China ghost. His talents was aching ter get action on him. Anything like that got up his spunk, says I. Maybe ranch you can't help. Well, tell him ter-morrow after guard mount I'll take his mind off of Daggett. No, yer don't, says Buck. Don't yer dare tell him. He's nervous as a cat over the pup, as it is, and this spook business is awful scary. I'm feelin' woozy over it myself. The remains of his corpse and planted him in this here graveyard up the road. But he wouldn't stay planted and began doing stunts at night, topside, walkie-walkie, and a-hunting for his lost button. He'd used ter have the whole country scared up, but for the last 20 years he'd kept right quiet and hardly ever come out. But now, since the foreign devils come, ain't that a sweet name for us, he's up and at it again, worse than ever, and the heathens is on their ear. For 4 nights now they'd seen him, wrapped in a blue robe, waiting and hunting behind tombstones and a-walking. Round and round the graveyard lies 6 days, raced for the belt at Madison Square. John had just seen him on the wall, and that was why he come charging down the road like 40 cats. Well, Mr. Ming's spurt walk till he gets that button back? Buck asks. John says, sure. Well, says Buck, why don't yer give him one? No can give, only Emperor, only Son of Heaven give. Well, look here, says Buck, we sand rabbits ain't no sons of heaven, but I'll be darned if we couldn't spare a button ter lay the ghost of a poor busted police court judge who's lost his job and his tin. If that's all he wants back, what time does he come out at, John? Could we see him ter-morrow night? Sure could we, says John. He'll show us the way, but he won't be waiting with us. He's bad enough for his. So Buck takes John and goes back ter the guard shack, as it's most time for relief, and after I got back, we told John ter get the hook, and we talked things over. And Buck, he was just wild ter see if he couldn't lay that China ghost. His talents was aching ter get action on him. Anything like that got up his spunk, says I. Maybe ranch you can't help. Well, tell him ter-morrow after guard mount I'll take his mind off of Daggett. "No, yer don't," says Buck. "Don't yer dare tell him. He's nervous as a cat over the pup as it is, and this spook business is awful skeery. I'm feelin' woozy over it myself. I'm all off when it comes ter ghosts. That is, if it's a real ghost. And things here in Perkin is so funny the odds is all in favor of its bein' the sure thing. I ain't afraid of no kinds o' people, but I sure get cold feet when I'm up against a ghost. Wouldn't that jar use? And me a soldier? When it's a soldier's whole business not to get cold feet. But I'm bound I'll have a show at that old spook, even if it does scare me out o' my growth. Only don't yer dare tell Ranch." Next night, right after 11 o'clock rounds, me and Buck slipped out of our blankets, sneaked out past the guard, and met John. He was waiting for us in the road just beyond where the last sentry would have seen him. It was cold as get out, just the same kind of old early cold as tonight, and John's teeth was a chatterin' like peas in a box. He was some loco with skeer, too, you bet. "Which way?" says Buck, and John spouts a lot o' dope joint lingo and takes us up a side alley where there's a whole bunch of old Chinos waitin' for us. And they began a kowtowin' and goin' on like we was the whole cheese. Turned out that John had jollied 'em that the Mexican soldier man's was big medicine and would make Judge Ming quit the midnight hikin' and cut out scarin' 'em blue. That just suit Buck. He was all there when it come ter play commander-in-chief. He swelled up and give 'em a bundle o' talk that John put in Chino for 'em, and then finished up by showin' 'em a button, a old United States Army brass button he'd cut off his blue blouse, and told 'em he was goin' ter bury it in Ming's grave so as ter keep him bedded down. And them simple idiots was pleased ter death, and the whole outfit escorted us over ter the graveyard, but they shed at the gate. Lord, I hated ter see 'em go, even if they was heathens, and let John take us in and show us where ter wait. He put us in behind a pile o' little rocks in about the middle o' the place near where Judge Ming hung out, and then retired on the main body at the double, leavin' us two in outpost alone here together. I hadn't never been ter a Chino buryin' ground before, and night time wasn't extry pleasant for a forced introduce. There was a new moon that night, a little shavin' of a thing that hardly gave no light, and from where we was there was a twisty pine tree branch that struck out right across it like a picture card. 2 for 5, the graveyard was all dark and quiet, with little piles o' rocks and stone tablets ter mark the graves, and a 4 or 5 foot wall runnin' all round it. And somehow, without nothin' stirrin' at all, the whole blame place seemed chock full o' movin' shadows. There wasn't a sound neither, not the last little thing, just them shadows, and the harder you'd look at 'em, the more they seemed ter move. It was cold, too, like I told yer, bitin' cold, and me and Buck squatted there tight together in moist freeze. We waited and we waited and we waited, and we got skirter and skirter and skirter, and gee, how we shivered. Every minute we thought we'd see Judge Ming, but a long time went by and he didn't come and he didn't come. There we set strung up tight and ready ter snap like a banjo string, but nothin' ter see but the shakin' shadders, and nothin' ter hear, nothin' but just dead silence. All of a sudden Buck, he kin hear a pin drop a mile away. Nearly nips a piece out in my arm as he grips me. "Listen," says he. I listened and listened, but I didn't hear nothin', and I told him so. "Yes, you do, you bloke, you," he whispers. "Listen. Strain your ears." Then way off I did begin ter hear somethin'. It was a long, funny, waily cry, sort o' like the way cats holler at each other at night. Oh, 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 like that, and it come near and near. Then all of a sudden something popped up on the graveyard wall about 100 yards away, something all blue-gray against the hook o' the moon, and began walking up and down and hollering. I knew it was saying words, but I was so far to the bad I didn't know nothing and couldn't make it out. I never thought a feller's heart could bang so hard against his ribs without busting out. And me hair riz so high, me camping hat was 3 inches off, and me had a hope ter the Lord I'll never be so frightened again in all my living days. I sat there in a trance from fear and fright, sir. The spot I don't know nothing o' what Buck was doing. As my lamps was glued to the spook, it jumped down from the wall, calling and whistling, and began running round the little stone heaps. I seen it was coming our way, but I couldn't move. My lamps was glued to the spook. It jumped down from the wall, calling and whistling, and began running round the little stone heaps. I seen it was coming our way, but I couldn't move or make a sound. I just sat. All of a sudden, Buck, he jumps up, makes a dash and a leap at the spook, and there's a terrible yelling, and they both comes down crash at the foot of a rock pile rolling on the little pebbles. But Buck is on top and the spook underneath and letting off the most awful skeeches. Gosh, they just ripping the air, them spooks yells did, and they just turned my spell loose, and I hauled for all I was worth. Then Buck, he commenced a yawping too. But me and the spook, we was both raising so much noise I didn't savvy what he said for some time. Then I found he was cussing me out. "Come here, you forsaken," he howls. "Quit yelling, I say, quit yelling. Don't yer see who this is? Come here and help me. You think I'm going ter protect that Ming spook?" I shrieks. "You miserable loony," he yells back. "Can't yer see it ain't no Ming? It's Ranch." Well, so it was. It was Ranch, scared stiff and hollering for dear life at me, and jumped on and waked up in the middle of a graveyard that a way poor old fellow had dagged on his mind, and went sleepwalking and hunting wrapped in his blanket. And says Buck ter me, "If yous hadn't been in such a dope dream with skeer, you'd 'a sensed what he was yelling. He was calling, 'Oh, oh, here, Daggett, here, boy.' And then he'd whistle and call again, 'Here, Daggett, here, Daggett.' That's how I knew it was Ranch. And besides, he told me yonct that he sleepwalked when he got worried, but you white-livered, and then he cussed me out some more. 'Smarty,' I says, 'if you knew so blame well it was Ranch, why did you give him the flying tackle like you done and get him all woked up like this?' 'Well,' says Buck, sort of sheepy, 'I was some woked up myself, and time he come along I gave him the spook's tackle without thinking. I was too scared to think. Hush, Ranch, hush, old boy. It's just me and Bill. Nobody shan't hurt ya.' He comforted poor old Ranch and fixed him up, and then when he felt better told him about things, all but how Daggett was at I wrapped his blanket around him and took him back to quarters, while Buck went looking for John and his gang. He found 'em about half a mile off in front of a Malt Street Joss house, all praying and bunning punk and huddled together, scared green from the yellings that they'd heard. Buck, he gave 'em a long chin about laying the ghost, and how Judge Ming wouldn't never come back no more, and then he dragged 'em all back, they pulling at the halter shanks with ears laid back and eyes a-rolling, to him bury his United States button on Ming's rock pile. He dropped it in a solemn and said what the Chinks took ter be a prayer, but he was really the oath, he said. Buck, having been a recruiting sergeant, knew it by heart all the way from "I do solemnly swear" to "So help me God," but says I oughta seen them grateful Chinos then. They'd a give him the whole Chino Empire if they could. They got down and squirmed and kissed his hands and his feet and his sleeve. They wanted to escort him back to camp, but he bucked at that and said no, as he was out without pass and not itching for his arrival ter be noticed none. After that we took turns watchin' ranch at night, and got him another mutt ter love, and he didn't wander any more, so Judge Ming seemed satisfied with his United States button, and kept quiet. But them Chinks was the gratefullest gang yer ever seen. They brought us presents, things ter eat, fruit, poultry, eggs, and all sorts of chow, some of it mighty funny lookin', but it tasted all right. We lived high, we three. The other fellers was wild ter know how we whopped it, and I tell yer I ain't never been scared o' ghosts since. That is, not ter speak of much." Bill paused, drew a long breath, and looked at the clock. "Gee," said he, "most 9 o'clock. I got ter go over ter K Troop ter see Sergeant Keefe a minute. I promised him. Adios, fellers. Thanks fer the smokin'. Keep the change, hombre. Thanks fer your tail," shouted Whitney after him as he disappeared down the hall. "Well," said Stone, and looked at Hanson. "Well," responded Hanson. The big Swede shook with laughter. "Is he not the finest lie? Yes, I was in the 14th myself. That was my company, Che. He was not even the army, and then in 1900. "Yes," said Stone, "I knew, but I was goin' to spoil his bloomin' yarn. I happened to see his enlistment card only this mornin', and the only thing he was ever in before was the 23rd Infantry after they came back from the islands. He's never even been out of the States." "But where did he get it from?" asked Whitney. "His imagination is equal to most anything but getting so many facts straight. Of course I noticed things here and there, but the most of it was O.K. "I tell you," said Hanson, grinning, "he got it from an old 14th man, Dan Powis, a practice camp last July. He and I was often talking of China. He was in my old company, and was then telling me how he and the other fellers all that extra chow got. I think Bill he has got a good memory." "But the nerve of him," cried Whitehall, "tryin' ter pass that off on us with Hanson sittin' right there." "It is one thing he may have forgot," smiled Hanson. "Well, who cares anyway?" said Stone. "It was a blame good story, and now clear out, all of you. I want to hit the bunk. Revel does seem to come so early these cold mornin's. Gee, I wish I knew of some kind of button that would keep me lying down when Shorty wants me to get up and call the roll. Ghosts that got the button." End of chapter 18. Recording by John Smith.
Chapter 19 of Humorous Ghost Stories. This is the LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Humorous Ghost Stories. Selected by Dorothy Scarborough. The Specter Bridegroom, A Traveler's Tale, by Washington Irving. On the summit of one of the heights of the Odenwald, a wild and romantic tract of Upper Germany that lies not far from the confluence of the Main and the Rhine, there stood many, many years since the castle of the Baron von Landshut. It is now quite fallen to decay, and almost buried among beech trees and dark firs, above which, however, its old watchtower may still be seen, struggling, like the former possessor I have mentioned, to carry a high head and look down upon the neighbouring country. The Baron was a dry branch of the great family of Katzenelnbogen, and inherited the relics of the property, and all the pride of his ancestors. Though the warlike disposition of his predecessors had much impaired the family possessions, the Baron still endeavoured to keep up some show of former state. The times were peaceable, and the German nobles in general had abandoned their inconvenient old castles, perched like eagle's nest among the mountains, and had built more convenient residences in the valleys. Still the Baron remained proudly drawn up in his little fortress, cherishing with hereditary inveteracy all the old family feuds, so that he was still on ill terms with some of his nearest neighbours, on account of disputes that had happened between their great-great-grandfathers. The Baron had but one child, a daughter. But nature, when she grants but one child, always compensates by making it a prodigy. And so it was with the daughter of the Baron. All the nurses, gossips, and country cousins assured her father that she had not her equal for beauty in all Germany, and who should know better than they? She had, moreover, been brought up with great care under the superintendence of two maiden aunts, who had spent some years of their early life at one of the little German courts, and were skilled in all branches of knowledge necessary to the education of a fine lady. Under their instructions she became a miracle of accomplishments. By the time she was 18, she could embroider to admiration, and had worked whole histories of the saints in tapestry, with such strength of expression in their countenances that they looked like so many souls in purgatory. She could read without great difficulty, and had spelled her way through several church legends, and almost all the chivalric wonders of the Heldenbuch. She had even made considerable proficiency in writing, could sign her own name without missing a letter, and so legibly that her aunts could read it without spectacles. She excelled in making little elegant, good-for-nothing, ladylike knick-knacks of all kinds, was versed in the most abstruse dancing of the day, played a number of airs on the harp and the guitar, and knew all the tender ballads of the Minnelieders by heart. Her aunts, too, having been great flirts and coquettes in their younger days, were admirably calculated to be vigilant guardians and strict censors of the conduct of their niece, for there is no duenna so rigidly prudent and inexorably decorous as a superannuated coquette. She was rarely suffered out of their sight, never went beyond the domains of the castle unless well attended, or rather well watched, had continual lectures read to her about strict decorum and implicit obedience, and as to the men, pah! She was taught to hold them at such a distance, and in such absolute distrust, that unless properly authorized, she would not have cast a glance upon the handsomest cavalier in the world, no, not if he were even dying at her feet. The good effects of this system were wonderfully apparent. The young lady was a pattern of docility and correctness. While others were wasting their sweetness in the glare of the world, and liable to be plucked and thrown aside by every hand, she was coyly blooming into fresh and lovely womanhood under the protection of those immaculate spinsters, like a rosebud blushing forth among guardian thorns. Her aunts looked upon her with pride and exultation, and vaunted that though all the other young ladies in the world might go astray, yet, thank heaven, nothing of the kind could happen to the heiress of Katzenelnbogen. But however scantily the Baron von Landshort might be provided with children, his household was by no means a small one, for Providence had enriched him with abundance of poor relations. They, one and all, possessed the affectionate disposition common to humble relatives, were wonderfully attached to the Baron, and took every possible occasion to come in swarms and enliven the castle. All family festivals were commemorated by these good people at the Baron's expense, and when they were filled with good cheer, they would declare that there was nothing on earth so delightful as these family meetings, these jubilees of the heart. The Baron, though a small man, had a large soul, and it swelled with satisfaction at the consciousness of being the greatest man in the little world around him. He loved to tell long stories about the dark old warriors whose portraits looked grimly down from the walls around, and he found no listeners equal to those that fed at his expense. He was much given to the marvellous, and a firm believer in all those supernatural tales with which every mountain and valley in Germany abounds. The faith of his guests exceeded even his own. They listened to every tale of wonder with open eyes and mouth, and never failed to be astonished, even though repeated for the 100th time. Thus lived the Baron von Landshort, the oracle of his table, the absolute monarch of his little territory, and happy, above all things, in the persuasion that he was the wisest man of the age. At the time of which my story treats, there was a great family gathering at the castle, on an affair of the utmost importance. It was to receive the destined bridegroom of the Baron's daughter. A negotiation had been carried on between the father and an old nobleman of Bavaria, to unite the dignity of their houses by the marriage of their children. The preliminaries had been conducted with proper punctilio. The young people were betrothed without seeing each other. and the time was appointed for the marriage ceremony. The young Count von Altenburg had been recalled from the army for the purpose, and was actually on his way to the Baron's to receive his bride. Missives had even been received from him from Würzburg, where he was accidentally detained, mentioning the day and hour when he might be expected to arrive. The castle was in a tumult of preparation to give him a suitable welcome. The fair bride had been decked out with uncommon care. The two aunts had superintended her toilet, and quarrelled the whole morning about every article of her dress. The young lady had taken advantage of their contest to follow the bent of her own taste, and fortunately it was a good one. She looked as lovely as youthful bridegroom could desire, and the flutter of expectation heightened the lustre of her charms. The suffusions that mantled her face and neck, the gentle heaving of the bosom, the eye now and then lost in reverie, all betrayed the soft tumult that was going on in her little heart. The aunts were continually hovering around her, for maiden aunts are apt to take great interest in affairs of this nature. They were giving her a world of staid counsel, how to deport herself, what to say, and in what manner to receive the expected lover. The Baron was no less busied in preparations. He had, in truth, nothing exactly to do, but he was naturally a fuming, bustling little man, and could not remain passive when all the world was in a hurry. He worried from top to bottom of the castle with an air of infinite anxiety. He continually called the servants from their work to exhort them to be diligent, and buzzed about every hall and chamber, as idly restless and importunate as a blue-bottle fly on a warm summer's day. In the meantime, the fatted calf had been killed. The forest had rung with the clamour of the huntsmen. The kitchen was crowded with good cheer. The cellars had yielded up whole oceans of Rhine wine and Fern wine, and even the great Heidelberg tun had been laid under contribution. Everything was ready to receive the distinguished guest with sauce and broth in the true spirit of German hospitality. But the guest delayed to make his appearance. Hour rolled after hour. The sun that had poured his downward rays upon the rich forest of the Odenwald now just gleamed along the summits of the mountains. The Baron mounted the highest tower, and strained his eyes in hope of catching a distant sight of the Count and his attendants. Once he thought he beheld them. The sounds of horns came floating from the valley, prolonged by the mountain echoes. A number of horsemen were seen far below, slowly advancing along the road. But when they had nearly reached the foot of the mountain, they suddenly struck off in a different direction. The last ray of sunshine departed. The bats began to flit by in the twilight. The road grew dimmer and dimmer to the view, and nothing appeared stirring in it but now and then a peasant lagging homeward from his labour. While the old castle at Landshut was in this state of perplexity, a very interesting scene was transacting in a different part of the Odenwald. The young Count von Altenburg was tranquilly pursuing his route in that sober, jog-trot way in which a man travels toward matrimony when his friends have taken all the trouble and uncertainty of courtship off his hands, and a bride is waiting for him as certainly as a dinner at the end of his journey. He had encountered at Würzburg a youthful companion in arms with whom he had seen some service on the frontiers. Hermann von Starkenfaust, one of the stoutest hands and worthiest hearts of German chivalry, who was now returning from the army. His father's castle was not far distant from the old fortress of Landshut, although an hereditary feud rendered the families hostile and strangers to each other. In the warm-hearted moment of recognition, the young friends related all their past adventures and fortunes, and the Count gave the whole history of his intended nuptials with a young lady whom he had never seen, but of whose charms he had received the most enrapturing descriptions. As the route of the friends lay in the same direction, they agreed to perform the rest of their journey together, and, that they might do it the more leisurely, set off from Würzburg at an early hour, the Count having given directions for his retinue to follow and overtake him. They beguiled their wayfaring with recollections of their military scenes and adventures, but the Count was apt to be a little tedious now and then, about the reputed charms of his bride and the felicity that awaited him. In this way they had entered among the mountains of the Odenwald, and were traversing one of its most lonely and thickly wooded passes. It is well known that the forests of Germany have always been as much infested by robbers as its castles by spectres, and at this time the former were particularly numerous, from the hordes of disbanded soldiers wandering about the country. It will not appear extraordinary, therefore, that the cavaliers were attacked by a gang of these stragglers in the midst of the forest. They defended themselves with bravery, but were nearly overpowered when the count's retinue arrived to their assistance. At sight of them the robbers fled, but not until the count had received a mortal wound. He was slowly and carefully conveyed back to the city of Würzburg, and a friar summoned from a neighbouring convent, who was famous for his skill in administering to both soul and body. But half of his skill was superfluous. The moments of the unfortunate count were numbered. With his dying breath he entreated his friend to repair instantly to the castle of Landshut, and explain the fatal cause of his not keeping his appointment with his bride. Though not the most ardent of lovers, he was one of the most punctilious of men, and appeared earnestly solicitous that his mission should be speedily and courteously executed.
"Unless this is done,"
said he,
"I shall not sleep quietly in my grave."
He repeated these last words with peculiar solemnity. A request, at a moment so impressive, admitted no hesitation. Starkenfast endeavoured to soothe him to calmness, promised faithfully to execute his wish, and gave him his hand in solemn pledge. The dying man pressed it in acknowledgment, but soon lapsed into delirium, raved about his bride, his engagements, his plighted word, ordered his horse that he might ride to the castle of Landshut, and expired in the fancied act of vaulting into the saddle. Starkenfast bestowed a sigh and a soldier's tear on the untimely fate of his comrade, and then pondered on the awkward mission he had undertaken. His heart was heavy and his head perplexed, for he was to present himself an unbidden guest among hostile people, and to damp their festivity with tidings fatal to their hopes. Still there were certain whisperings of curiosity in his bosom to see this far-famed beauty of Katzenelnbogen, so cautiously shut up from the world, for he was a passionate admirer of the sex, and there was a dash of eccentricity and enterprise in his character that made him fond of all singular adventure. Previous to his departure he made all due arrangements with the holy fraternity of the convent for the funeral solemnities of his friend, who was to be buried in the cathedral of Würzburg, near some of his illustrious relatives, and the mourning retinue of the count took charge of his remains. It is now high time that we should return to the ancient family of Katzenelnbogen, who were impatient for their guest, and still more for their dinner, and to the worthy little baron, whom we left airing himself on the watch-tower. Night closed in, but still no guest arrived. The baron descended from the tower in despair. The banquet, which had been delayed from hour to hour, could no longer be postponed. The meats were already overdone, the cook in an agony, and the whole household had the look of a garrison that had been reduced by famine. The baron was obliged reluctantly to give orders for the feast without the presence of the guest. All were seated at table, and just on the point of commencing, when the sound of a horn from without the gate gave notice of the approach of a stranger. Another long blast filled the old courts of the castle with its echoes, and was answered by the warder from the walls. The baron hastened to receive his future son-in-law. The drawbridge had been let down, and the stranger was before the gate. He was a tall, gallant cavalier, mounted on a black steed. His countenance was pale, but he had a beaming, romantic eye, and an air of stately melancholy. The baron was a little mortified that he should have come in this simple, solitary style. His dignity for a moment was ruffled, and he felt disposed to consider it a want of proper respect for the important occasion, and the important family with which he was to be connected. He pacified himself, however, with the conclusion that it must have been youthful impatience which had induced him thus to spur on sooner than his attendants.
"I am sorry," said the stranger, "to break in upon you thus unseasonably."
Here the baron interrupted with a world of compliments and greetings, for, to tell the truth, he prided himself upon his courtesy and eloquence. The stranger attempted once or twice to stem the torrent of words, but in vain, so he bowed his head and suffered it to flow on. By the time the Baron had come to a pause, they had reached the inner court of the castle, and the stranger was again about to speak, when he was once more interrupted by the appearance of the female part of the family leading forth the shrinking and blushing bride. He gazed on her for a moment as one entranced. It seemed as if his whole soul beamed forth in the gaze, and rested upon that lovely form. One of the maiden aunts whispered something in her ear. She made an effort to speak. Her moist blue eye was timidly raised, gave a shy glance of inquiry on the stranger, and was cast again to the ground. The words died away, but there was a sweet smile playing about her lips, and a soft dimpling of the cheek that showed her glance had not been unsatisfactory. It was impossible for a girl of the fond age of 18, highly predisposed for love and matrimony, not to be pleased with so gallant a cavalier. The late hour at which the guest had arrived left no time for parley. The Baron was peremptory, and deferred all particular conversation until the morning, and led the way to the untasted banquet. It was served up in the great hall of the castle. Around the walls hung the hard-favoured portraits of the heroes of the house of Katzenelnbogen, and the trophies which they had gained in the field and in the chase. Hacked corselets, splintered jousting spears, and tattered banners were mingled with the spoils of sylvan warfare. The jaws of the wolf and the tusks of the boar grinned horribly among crossbows and battle-axes, and a huge pair of antlers branched immediately over the head of the youthful bridegroom. The cavalier took but little notice of the company or the entertainment. He scarcely tasted the banquet, but seemed absorbed in the admiration of his bride. He conversed in a low tone that could not be overheard, for the language of love is never loud. But where is the female ear so dull that it cannot catch the softest whisper of the lover? There was a mingled tenderness and gravity in his manner that appeared to have a powerful effect upon the young lady. Her colour came and went as she listened with deep attention. Now and then she made some blushing reply, and when his eye was turned away, she would steal a sidelong glance at his romantic countenance, and heave a gentle sigh of tender happiness. It was evident that the young couple were completely enamoured. The aunts, who were deeply versed in the mysteries of the heart, declared that they had fallen in love with each other at first sight. The feast went on merrily, or at least noisily, for the guests were all blessed with those keen appetites that attend upon light purses and mountain air. The Baron told his best and longest stories, and never had he told them so well or with such great effect. If there was anything marvellous, his auditors were lost in astonishment, and if anything facetious, they were sure to laugh exactly in the right place. The Baron, it is true, like most great men, was too dignified to utter any joke but a dull one. It was always enforced, however, by a bumper of excellent Hockheimer, and even a dull joke at one's own table, served up with jolly old wine, is irresistible. Many good things were said by poorer and keener wits that could not bear repeating, except on similar occasions. Many sly speeches whispered in ladies' ears that almost convulsed them with suppressed laughter, and a song or two roared out by a poor but merry and broad-faced cousin of the Baron that absolutely made the maiden aunts hold up their fans. Amidst all this revelry, the stranger guest maintained a most singular and unseasonable gravity. His countenance assumed a deeper cast of dejection as the evening advanced, and, strange as it may appear, even the Baron's jokes seemed only to render him the more melancholy. At times he was lost in thought, and at times there was a perturbed and restless wandering of the eye that bespoke a mind but ill at ease. His conversations with the bride became more and more earnest and mysterious. Lowering clouds began to steal over the fair serenity of her brow, and tremors to run through her tender frame. All this could not escape the notice of the company. Their gaiety was chilled by the unaccountable gloom of the bridegroom. Their spirits were infected. Whispers and glances were interchanged, accompanied by shrugs and dubious shakes of the head. The song and the laugh grew less and less frequent. There were dreary pauses in the conversation, which were at length succeeded by wild tales and supernatural legends. One dismal story produced another still more dismal, and the Baron nearly frightened some of the ladies into hysterics with the story of a goblin horseman that carried away the fair Leonora, a dreadful story which has since been put into excellent verse, and is read and believed by all the world. The bridegroom listened to this tale with profound attention. He kept his eyes steadily fixed on the Baron, and, as the story drew to a close, began gradually to rise from his seat, growing taller and taller, until in the Baron's entranced eye he seemed almost to tower into a giant. The moment the tale was finished, he heaved a deep sigh, and took a solemn farewell of the company. They were all amazement. The Baron was completely thunderstruck.
"What? Going to leave the castle at midnight? Why, everything was prepared for his reception. A chamber was ready for him if he wished to retire."
The stranger shook his head mournfully and mysteriously.
"I must lay my head in a different chamber tonight."
There was something in this reply, and the tone in which it was uttered, that made the Baron's heart misgive him, but he rallied his forces and repeated his hospitable entreaties. The stranger shook his head silently, but positively, at every offer, and waving his farewell to the company, stalked slowly out of the hall. The maiden aunts were absolutely petrified. The bride hung her head, and a tear stole to her eye. The Baron followed the stranger to the great court of the castle, where the black charger stood pawing the earth and snorting with impatience. When they had reached the portal, whose deep archway was dimly lighted by a cresset, the stranger paused, and addressed the Baron in a hollow tone of voice which the vaulted roof rendered still more sepulchral.
"Now that we are alone," said he,
"I will impart to you the reason of my going. I have a solemn and indispensable engagement."
"Why," said the Baron, "cannot you send someone in your place?"
"It admits of no substitute. I must attend it in person. I must away to Würzburg Cathedral."
"Aye," said the Baron, plucking up spirit, "but not until tomorrow. Tomorrow you should take your bride there."
"No, no," replied the stranger with tenfold solemnity.
"My engagement is with no bride. The worms expect me. I am a dead man. I have been slain by robbers. My body lies at Würzburg. At midnight I am to be buried. The grave is waiting for me. I must keep my appointment."
He sprang on his black charger, dashed over the drawbridge, and the clattering of his horse's hoofs was lost in the whistling of the night blast. The Baron returned to the hall in utmost consternation, and related what had passed. 2 ladies fainted outright, others sickened at the idea of having banqueted with a spectre. It was the opinion of some that this might be the wild huntsman famous in German legend. Some talked of mountain sprites, of wood demons, and of other supernatural beings, with which the good people of Germany have been so grievously harassed since time immemorial. One of the poor relations ventured to suggest that it might be some sportive evasion of the young cavalier, and that the very gloominess of the caprice seemed to accord with so melancholy a personage. This, however, drew on him the indignation of the whole company, and especially of the Baron, who looked upon him as little better than an infidel, so that he was pained to abjure his heresy as speedily as possible, and come into the faith of the true believers. But whatever may have been the doubts entertained, they were completely put to an end by the arrival next day of regular missives confirming the intelligence of the young Count's murder and his interment in Würzburg Cathedral. The dismay of the castle may well be imagined. The Baron shut himself up in his chamber. The guests who had come to rejoice with him could not think of abandoning him in his distress. They wandered about the courts or collected in groups in the hall, shaking their heads and shrugging their shoulders at the troubles of so good a man, and sat longer than ever at table, and ate and drank more stoutly than ever, by way of keeping up their spirits. But the situation of the widowed bride was the most pitiable. To have lost a husband before she had even embraced him, and such a husband! If the very spectre could be so gracious and noble, what must have been the living man? She filled the house with lamentations. On the night of the 2nd day of her widowhood, she had retired to her chamber, accompanied by one of her aunts who insisted on sleeping with her. The aunt, who was one of the best tellers of ghost stories in all Germany, had just been recounting one of her longest, and had fallen asleep in the very midst of it. The chamber was remote and overlooked a small garden. The niece lay pensively gazing at the beams of the rising moon as they trembled on the leaves of an aspen tree before the lattice. The castle clock had just tolled midnight, when a soft strain of music stole up from the garden. She rose hastily from her bed and stepped lightly to the window. A tall figure stood among the shadows of the trees. As it raised its head, a beam of moonlight fell upon the countenance. Heaven and earth! She beheld the Specter Bridegroom! A loud shriek at that moment burst upon her ear, and her aunt, who had been awakened by the music, had followed her silently to the window, fell into her arms. When she looked again, the spectre had disappeared. Of the two females, the aunt now required the most soothing, for she was perfectly beside herself with terror. As to the young lady, there was something, even in the spectre of her lover, that seemed endearing. There was still the semblance of manly beauty, and though the shadow of a man is but little calculated to satisfy the affections of a love-sick girl, yet where the substance is not to be had, even that is consoling. The aunt declared she would never sleep in that chamber again. The niece, for once, was refractory, and declared as strongly that she would sleep in no other in the castle. The consequence was that she had to sleep in it alone. But she drew a promise from her aunt not to relate the story of the spectre, lest she should be denied the only melancholy pleasure left her on the earth, that of inhabiting the chamber over which the guardian shade of her lover kept his nightly vigils. How long the good old lady would have observed this promise is uncertain, for she dearly loved to talk of the marvellous, and there is a triumph in being the first to tell a frightful story. It is, however, still quoted in the neighbourhood as a memorial instance of female secrecy that she kept it to herself for a whole week, when she was suddenly absolved from all further restraint by intelligence, brought to the breakfast table one morning, that the young lady was not to be found. Her room was empty, the bed had not been slept in, the window was open, and the bird had flown. The astonishment and concern with which the intelligence was received can only be imagined by those who have witnessed the agitation which the mishaps of a great man cause among his friends. Even the poor relations paused for a moment from the indefatigable labours of the trencher, when the aunt, who had at first been struck speechless, wrung her hands and shrieked out, "The goblin! The goblin! She's carried away by the goblin!" In a few words she related the fearful scene of the garden, and concluded that the spectre must have carried off his bride. Two of the domestics corroborated the opinion, for they had heard the clattering of a horse's hoofs down the mountain about midnight, and had no doubt that it was the spectre on his black charger, bearing her away to the tomb. All present were struck with the direful probability, for events of the kind are extremely common in Germany, as many well-authenticated histories bear witness. What a lamentable situation was that of the poor Baron! What a heartrending dilemma for a fond father, and a member of the great family of Katzenelnbogen! His only daughter had either been rapt away to the grave, or he was to have some wood demon for a son-in-law, and perchance a troop of goblin grandchildren. As usual, he was completely bewildered, and all the castle in an uproar. The men were ordered to take horse and scour every road and path and glen of the Odenwald. The Baron himself had just drawn on his jack-boots, girded on his sword, and was about to mount his steed to sally forth on the doubtful quest, when he was brought to a pause by a new apparition. A lady was seen approaching the castle, mounted on a palfrey, attended by a cavalier on horseback. She galloped up to the gate, sprang from her horse, and falling at the Baron's feet, embraced his knees. It was his lost daughter, and her companion, the Specter Bridegroom. The Baron was astounded. He looked at his daughter, then at the spectre, and almost doubted the evidence of his senses. The latter, too, was wonderfully improved in his appearance since his visit to the world of spirits. His dress was splendid, and set off a noble figure of manly symmetry. He was no longer pale and melancholy. His fine countenance was flushed with the glow of youth, and joy rioted in his large dark eye. The mystery was soon cleared up. The cavalier, for in truth, as you must have known all the while, he was no goblin, announced himself as Sir Hermann von Starkenfast. He related his adventure with the young count. He told how he had hastened to the castle to deliver the unwelcome tidings, but that the eloquence of the baron had interrupted him in every attempt to tell his tale. How the sight of the bride had completely captivated him, and that to pass a few hours near her he had tacitly suffered the mistake to continue. How he had been sorely perplexed in what way to make a decent retreat until the baron's goblin stories had suggested his eccentric exit. How, fearing the feudal hostility of the family, he had repeated his visits by stealth, had haunted the garden beneath the young lady's window, had wooed and won, had borne away in triumph, and, in a word, had wedded the fair. Under any other circumstances the baron would have been inflexible, for he was tenacious of paternal authority, and devoutly obstinate in all family feuds. But he loved his daughter, he had lamented her as lost. He rejoiced to find her still alive, and though her husband was of a hostile house, yet thank heaven he was not a goblin. There was something, it must be acknowledged, that did not exactly accord with his notions of strict veracity, in the joke the knight had passed upon him of his being a dead man, but several old friends present, who had served in the wars, assured him that every stratagem was excusable in love, and that the cavalier was entitled to a special privilege, having lately served as a trooper. Matters, therefore, were happily arranged. The baron pardoned the young couple on the spot. The revels at the castle were resumed. The poor relations overwhelmed this new member of the family with loving kindness. He was so gallant, so generous, and so rich. The aunts, it is true, were somewhat scandalized that their system of strict seclusion and passive obedience should be so badly exemplified, but attributed it to all their negligence in not having the windows grated. One of them was particularly mortified at having her marvellous story marred, and that the only spectre she had ever seen should turn out to be a counterfeit. But the niece seemed perfectly happy at having found him substantial flesh and blood, and so the story ends. End of The Specter Bridegroom, recorded by Michelle Good, Huntsville, Alabama, August 24th, 2013.
Chapter 20 of Humorous Ghost Stories. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Humorous Ghost Stories, selected by Dorothy Scarborough. Chapter 20, The Specter of Tappington, Part 1, from the Ingoldsby Legends, compiled by Richard Barham. It is very odd, though. What can have become of them? Said Charles Seaforth, as he peeped under the valance of an old-fashioned bedstead, in an old-fashioned apartment of a still more old-fashioned manor-house. "'Tis confoundedly odd, and I can't make it out at all." "Why, Barney, where are they? And where the devil are you?" No answer was returned to this appeal, and the lieutenant, who was, in the main, a reasonable person, at least as reasonable a person as any young gentleman of 22 in the service can fairly be expected to be, cooled when he reflected that his servant could scarcely reply extempore to a summons which it was impossible he should hear. An application to the bell was the considerate result, and the footsteps of as tight a lad as ever put pipe-clay to belt sounded along the gallery. "Come in," said his master. An ineffectual attempt upon the door reminded Mr. Seaforth that he had locked himself in. "By heaven! This is the oddest thing of all," said he, as he turned the key and admitted Mr. Maguire into his dormitory. "Barney, where are my pantaloons?" "Is it the breeches?" asked the valet, casting an inquiring eye round the apartment. "Is it the breeches, sir?" "Yes. What have you done with them?" Sure then your honour had them on when you went to bed, and it's hereabouts they'll be, I'll be bail." And Barney lifted a fashionable tunic from a cane-backed armchair, proceeding in his examination. But the search was in vain. There was the tunic aforesaid, there was a smart-looking kerseymere waistcoat, but the most important article of all in a gentleman's wardrobe was still wanting. "Where can they be?" asked the master, with a strong accent on the auxiliary verb. "Sorrow a know I knows," said the man. "It must have been the devil, then, after all, who has been here and carried them off!" cried Seaforth, staring full into Barney's face. Mr. Maguire was not devoid of the superstition of his countrymen, still he looked as if he did not quite subscribe to the sequitur. His master read incredulity in his countenance. "Why, I tell you, Barney, I put them there, on that armchair, when I got into bed; and, by heaven, I distinctly saw the ghost of the old fellow they told me of, come in at midnight, put on my pantaloons, and walk away with them." "Maybe so," was the cautious reply. "I thought, of course, it was a dream; but then, where the dell are the breeches?" The question was more easily asked than answered. Barney renewed his search, while the lieutenant folded his arms, and, leaning against the toilet, sunk into a reverie. "After all, it must be some trick of my laughter-loving cousins," said Seaforth. "Ah, then, the ladies!" chimed in Mr. Maguire, though the observation was not addressed to him. "And it will be Miss Caroline or Miss Fanny, that's stole your honour's things?" "I hardly know what to think of it," pursued the bereaved lieutenant, still speaking in soliloquy, with his eye resting dubiously on the chamber door. "I locked myself in, that's certain; but there must be some other entrance to the room. Pooh! I remember, the private staircase. How could I be such a fool?" And he crossed the chamber to where a low oaken doorcase was dimly visible in a distant corner. He paused before it. Nothing now interfered to screen it from observation; but it bore tokens of having been at some earlier period concealed by tapestry, remains of which yet clothed the walls on either side the portal. "This way they must have come," said Seaforth. "I wish with all my heart I had caught them." "Och, the kittens!" sighed Mr. Barry Maguire. But the mystery was yet as far from being solved as before. True, there was the other door; but then that, too, on examination, was even more firmly secured than the one which opened on the gallery. Two heavy bolts on the inside effectually prevented any coup de main on the lieutenant's bivouac from that quarter. He was more puzzled than ever; nor did the minutest inspection of the walls and floor throw any light upon the subject. One thing only was clear: the breeches were gone. "It is very singular," said the lieutenant. Tappington, generally called Tapton, Everard is an antiquated but commodious manor house in the eastern division of the county of Kent. A former proprietor had been high sheriff in the days of Elizabeth, and many a dark and dismal tradition was yet extant of the licentiousness of his life, and the enormity of his offences. The glen, which the keeper's daughter was seen to enter, but never known to quit, still frowns darkly as of yore, while an ineradicable bloodstain on the oaken stair yet bids defiance to the united energies of soap and sand. But it is with one particular apartment that a deed of more especial atrocity is said to be connected. A strange guest, so runs the legend, arrived unexpectedly at the mansion of the bad Sir Giles. They met in apparent friendship; but the ill-concealed scowl on their master's brow told the domestics that the visit was not a welcome one. The banquet, however, was not spared. The wine-cup circulated freely, too freely, perhaps, for sounds of discord at length reached the ears of even the excluded serving-men, as they were doing their best to imitate their betters in the lower hall. Alarmed, some of them ventured to approach the parlour. One, an old and favoured retainer of the house, went so far as to break in upon his master's privacy. Sir Giles, already high in oath, fiercely enjoined his absence, and he retired; not, however, before he had distinctly heard from the stranger's lips a menace that there was that within his pocket which could disprove the knight's right to issue that or any other command within the walls of Tappington. The intrusion, though momentary, seemed to have produced a beneficial effect. The voices of the disputants fell, and the conversation was carried on thenceforth in a more subdued tone, till, as evening closed in, the domestics, when summoned to attend with lights, found not only cordiality restored, but that a still deeper carouse was meditated. Fresh stoups, and from the choicest bins, were produced; nor was it till at a late, or rather early hour, that the revellers sought their chambers. The one allotted to the stranger occupied the first floor of the eastern angle of the building, and had once been the favourite apartment of Sir Giles himself. Scandal ascribed this preference to the facility which a private staircase, communicating with the grounds, had afforded him in the old knight's time, of following his wicked courses unchecked by parental observation, a consideration which ceased to be of weight when the death of his father left him uncontrolled master of his estate and actions. From that period Sir Giles had established himself in what were called the state apartments, and the oaken chamber was rarely tenanted, save on occasions of extraordinary festivity, or when the Yule log drew an unusually large accession of guests around the Christmas hearth. On this eventful night it was prepared for the unknown visitor, who sought his couch heated and inflamed from his midnight orgies, and in the morning was found in his bed a swollen and blackened corpse. No marks of violence appeared upon the body, but the livid hue of the lips, and certain dark-coloured spots visible on the skin, aroused suspicions which those who entertained them were too timid to express. Apoplexy, induced by the excesses of the preceding night, Sir Giles's confidential leech pronounced to be the cause of his sudden dissolution. The body was buried in peace; and though some shook their heads as they witnessed the haste with which the funeral rites were hurried on, none ventured to murmur. Other events arose to distract the attention of the retainers. Men's minds became occupied by the stirring politics of the day, while the near approach of that formidable armada, so vainly arrogating itself a title which the very elements joined with human valour to disprove, soon interfered to weaken if not obliterate, all remembrance of the nameless stranger who had died within the walls of Tapton Everard. Years rolled on. The bad Sir Giles had himself long since gone to his account, the last, as it was believed, of his immediate line, though a few of the older tenants were sometimes heard to speak of an elder brother, who had disappeared early in life, and never inherited the estate. Rumours, too, of his having left a son in foreign lands, were at one time rife; but they died away, nothing occurring to support them. The property passed unchallenged to a collateral branch of the family, and the secret, if secret there were, was buried in Denton churchyard, in the lonely grave of the mysterious stranger. One circumstance alone occurred, after a long intervening period, to revive the memory of these transactions. Some workmen employed in grubbing an old plantation, for the purpose of raising on its site a modern shrubbery, dug up, in the execution of their task, the mildewed remnants of what seemed to have been once a garment. On more minute inspection, enough remained of silken slashes and a coarse embroidery to identify the relics as having once formed part of a pair of trunk hose, while a few papers which fell from them, altogether illegible from damp and age, were by the unlearned rustics conveyed to the then owner of the estate. Whether the squire was more successful in deciphering them was never known, he certainly never alluded to their contents; and little would have been thought of the matter but for the inconvenient memory of one old woman, who declared she heard her grandfather say, that when the strange guest was poisoned, though all the rest of his clothes were there, his breeches, the supposed repository of the supposed documents, could never be found. The master of Tapton Everard smiled when he heard Dame Jones's hint of deeds which might impeach the validity of his own title in favour of some unknown descendant of some unknown heir; and the story was rarely alluded to, save by one or two miracle mongers, who had heard that others had seen the ghost of old Sir Giles, in his nightcap, issue from the postern, enter the adjoining copse, and wring his shadowy hands in agony, as he seemed to search vainly for something hidden among the evergreens. The stranger's death-room had, of course, been occasionally haunted from the time of his decease, but the periods of visitation had latterly become very rare; even Mrs. Botherby, the housekeeper, being forced to admit that, during her long sojourn at the manor, she had never met with anything worse than herself; though, as the old lady afterwards added upon more mature reflection, "I must say I think I saw the devil once." Such was the legend attached to Tapton Everard, and such the story which the lively Caroline Ingoldsby detailed to her equally mercurial cousin, Charles Seaforth, lieutenant in the Honourable East India Company's 2nd Regiment of Bombay Fencibles, as arm in arm they promenaded a gallery decked with some dozen grim-looking ancestral portraits, and, among others, with that of the redoubted Sir Giles himself. The gallant commander had that very morning paid his first visit to the house of his maternal uncle, after an absence of several years passed with his regiment on the arid plains of Hindostan, whence he was now returned on a 3 years' furlough. He had gone out a boy; he returned a man; but the impression made upon his youthful fancy by his favourite cousin remained unimpaired, and to Tapton he directed his steps, even before he sought the home of his widowed mother; comforting himself in this breach of filial decorum by the reflection that, as the manor was so little out of his way, it would be unkind to pass, as it were, the door of his relatives, without just looking in for a few hours. But he found his uncle as hospitable, and his cousin more charming than ever; and the looks of one, and the requests of the other, soon precluded the possibility of refusing to lengthen the few hours into a few days, though the house was at the moment full of visitors. The Peterses were from Ramsgate; and Mr., Mrs., and 2 Miss Simpkinsons, from Bath, had come to pass a month with the family; and Tom Ingoldsby had brought down his college friend the Honourable Augustus Suckle Thumbkin, with his groom and pointers, to take a fortnight's shooting. And then there was Mrs. Ogleton, the rich young widow, with her large black eyes, who, people did say, was setting her cap at the young squire, though Mrs. Botherby did not believe it; and, above all, there was Mademoiselle Pauline, her femme de chambre, who mon-dieu'd everything and everybody, and cried quelle horreur at Mrs. Botherby's cap. In short, to use the last named and much respected lady's own expression, the house was choke full to the very attics; all save the oaken chamber, which, as the lieutenant expressed a most magnanimous disregard of ghosts, was forthwith appropriated to his particular accommodation. Mr. Maguire meanwhile was fain to share the apartment of Oliver Dobbs, the squire's own man; a jocular proposal of joint occupancy having been first indignantly rejected by Mademoiselle, though preferred with the last taste in life of Mr. Barney's most insinuating brogue. "Come, Charles, the urn is absolutely getting cold. Your breakfast will be quite spoiled. What can have made you so idle?" Such was the morning salutation of Miss Ingoldsby to the militaire as he entered the breakfast room half an hour after the latest of the party. "A pretty gentleman, truly, to make an appointment with," chimed in Miss Frances. "What has become of our ramble to the rocks before breakfast?" "Oh, the young men never think of keeping a promise now," said Mrs. Peters, a little ferret-faced woman with underdone eyes. "When I was a young man," said Mr. Peters, "I remember I always made a point of—" "Pray, how long ago was that?" asked Mr. Simpkinson from Bath. "Why, sir, when I married Mrs. Peters, I was—let me see—I was—" "Do pray hold your tongue, P., and eat your breakfast," interrupted his better half, who had a mortal horror of chronological references. "It's very rude to tease people with your family affairs." The lieutenant had by this time taken his seat in silence; a good-humored nod, and a glance, half smiling, half inquisitive, being the extent of his salutation. Smitten as he was, and in the immediate presence of her who had made so large a hole in his heart, his manner was evidently distrait, which the fair Caroline in her secret soul attributed to his being solely occupied by her agrèmens. How would she have bridled had she known that they only shared his meditations with a pair of breeches? Charles drank his coffee and spiked some half-dozen eggs, darting occasionally a penetrating glance at the ladies, in hope of detecting the supposed waggery by the evidence of some furtive smile or conscious look. But in vain. Not a dimple moved indicative of roguery, nor did the slightest elevation of eyebrow rise confirmative of his suspicions. Hints and insinuations passed unheeded, more particular inquiries were out of the question, the subject was unapproachable. In the meantime, patent cords were just the thing for a morning's ride; and, breakfast ended, away cantered the party over the downs, till, every faculty absorbed by the beauties, animate and inanimate, which surrounded him. Lieutenant Seaforth of the Bombay Fencibles bestowed no more thought upon his breeches than if he had been born on the top of Ben Lomond. Another night passed away. The sun rose brilliantly, forming with his level beams a splendid rainbow in the far-off west, whither the heavy cloud, which for the last 2 hours had been pouring its waters on the earth, was now flying before him. "Ah, then, and it's little good it'll be the clanning of ye," apostrophized Mr. Barry Maguire, as he deposited, in front of his master's toilet, a pair of brand-new jockey boots, one of Hoby's primmest fits, which the lieutenant had purchased on his way through town. On that very morning they had come for the first time under the valet's depurating hand, so little soiled, indeed, from the turfy ride of the preceding day, that a less scrupulous domestic might, perhaps, have considered the application of Warren's Matchless, or oxalic acid, altogether superfluous. Not so Barney. With the nicest care had he removed the slightest impurity from each polished surface, and there they stood, rejoicing in their sable radiance. No wonder a pang shot across Mr. Maguire's breast as he thought on the work now cut out for them, so different from the light labors of the day before; no wonder he murmured with a sigh, as the scarce dried window-panes disclosed a road now inch-deep in mud. "Ah, then, it's little good clannin' of ye!" For well had he learned in the hall below that 8 miles of a stiff clay soil lay between the manor and Bolsover Abbey, whose picturesque ruins, like ancient Rome, majestic in decay, the party had determined to explore. The master had already commenced dressing, and the man was fitting straps upon a light pair of crane-necked spurs, when his hand was arrested by the old question: "Barney, where are the breeches?" They were nowhere to be found. Mr. Seaforth descended that morning, whip in hand, and equipped in a handsome green riding frock, but no breeches and boots to match were there. Loose jean trousers, surmounting a pair of diminutive Wellingtons, embraced, somewhat incongruously, his nether man, vice the patent cords, returned, like yesterday's pantaloons, absent without leave. The top boots had a holiday. "A fine morning after the rain," said Mr. Simpkinson from Bath. "Just the thing for the ops," said Mr. Peters. "I remember when I was a boy." "Do hold your tongue, P," said Mrs. Peters, advice which that exemplary matron was in the constant habit of administering to her P, as she called him, whenever he prepared to vent his reminiscences. Her precise reason for this it would be difficult to determine, unless, indeed, the story be true which a little bird had whispered into Mrs. Botherby's ear. Mr. Peters, though now a wealthy man, had received a liberal education at a charity school, and was apt to recur to the days of his muffin cap and leathers. As usual, he took his wife's hint in good part, and paused in his reply. "A glorious day for the ruins," said young Ingoldsby. "But, Charles, what the deuce are you about? You don't mean to ride through our lanes in such toggery as that?" "Lassy me!" said Miss Julia Simpkinson, "won't you be very wet?" "You had better take Tom's cab," quoth the squire. But this proposition was at once overruled. Mrs. Ogleton had already nailed the cab, a vehicle of all others the best adapted for a snug flirtation. Or drive Miss Julia in the phaeton? No. That was the post of Mr. Peters, who, indifferent as an equestrian, had acquired some fame as a whip while travelling through the Midland counties for the firm of Bagshaw, Snivelby, and Grimes. "Thank you, I shall ride with my cousins," said Charles, with as much nonchalance as he could assume, and he did so. Mr. Ingoldsby, Mrs. Peters, Mr. Simpkinson from Bath, and his eldest daughter with her album, followed in the family coach. The gentleman commoner voted the affair "donned slow," and declined the party altogether in favor of the gamekeeper and a cigar. There was no fun in looking at old houses. Mrs. Simpkinson preferred a short sojourn in the still room with Mrs. Botherby, who had promised to initiate her in the grand arcanum, the transmutation of gooseberry jam into guava jelly. "Did you ever see an old abbey before, Mrs. Peters?" "Yes, miss, a French one. We have got one at Ramsgate. He teaches the Miss Joneses to parlez-vous and is turned of 60. Miss Simpkinson closed her album with an air of ineffable disdain. Mr. Simpkinson from Bath was a professed antiquary, and one of the first water. He was master of Gwillim's Heraldry, and Mill's History of the Crusades; knew every plate in the Monasticon; had written an essay on the origin and dignity of the office of overseer, and settled the date on a Queen Anne's farthing. An influential member of the Antiquarian Society, to whose Beauties of Bagnigge Wells he had been a liberal subscriber, procured him a seat at the board of that learned body, since which happy epoch Sylvanus Urban had not a more indefatigable correspondent. His inaugural essay on the President's cocked hat was considered a miracle of erudition; and his account of the earliest application of gilding to gingerbread, a masterpiece of antiquarian research. His eldest daughter was of a kindred spirit. If her father's mantle had not fallen upon her, it was only because he had not thrown it off himself. She had caught hold of its tail, however, while it yet hung upon his honored shoulders. To souls so congenial, what a sight was the magnificent ruin of Bolsover, its broken arches, its mouldering pinnacles, and the airy tracery of its half-demolished windows. The party were in raptures. Mr. Simpkinson began to meditate an essay, and his daughter an ode. Even Seaforth, as he gazed on these lonely relics of the olden time, was betrayed into a momentary forgetfulness of his love and losses. The widow's eyeglass turned from her cicisbe's whiskers to the mantling ivy. Mrs. Peters wiped her spectacles. And her P supposed the central tower had once been the county jail. The squire was a philosopher, and had been there often before, so he ordered out the cold tongue and chickens. "Bolsover Priory," said Mr. Simpkinson, with the air of a connoisseur. "Bolsover Priory was founded in the reign of Henry VI., about the beginning of the 11th century. Hugh de Bolsover had accompanied that monarch to the Holy Land, in the expedition undertaken by way of penance for the murder of his young nephews in the Tower. Upon the dissolution of the monasteries, the veteran was enfeoffed in the Lands End manor, to which he gave his own name of Bolsover, or B. Owls over, by corruption Bolsover. A B in chief, over 3 owls, all proper, being the armorial ensigns borne by this distinguished crusader at the siege of Acre." "Ah, that was Sir Sidney Smith," said Mr. Peters. "I've heard tell of him, and all about Mrs. Partington, and—" "Be quiet, and don't expose yourself," sharply interrupted his lady. P. was silenced, and betook himself to the bottled stout. "These lands," continued the antiquary, "were held in grand serjeantry by the presentation of 3 white owls and a pot of honey." "Lassy me! how nice!" said Miss Julia. Mr. Peters licked his lips. "Pray give me leave, my dear. Owls and honey, whenever the king should come a rat-catching into this part of the country." "Rat-catching!" ejaculated the squire, pausing abruptly in the mastication of a drumstick. "To be sure, my dear sir. Don't you remember the rats came under the forest laws? A minor species of venison? Rats and mice, and such small deer, eh? Shakespeare, you know. Our ancestors ate rats. The nasty fellows!" shuddered Miss Julia, in a parenthesis. "And owls, you know, are capital mousers." "I've seen a howl," said Mr. Peters. "There's one in the Zoological Gardens. A little hook-nosed chap in a wig. Only its feathers and—" Poor P. was never destined to finish a speech. "Do be quiet!" cried the authoritative voice; and the would-be naturalist shrank into his shell, like a snail in the Zoological Gardens. "You should read Blunt's Jocular Tenures, Mr. Ingoldsby," pursued Simpkinson. "What a learned man was Blunt! Why, sir, His Royal Highness the Duke of York once paid a silver horseshoe to Lord Ferrars—" "I've heard of him," broke in the incorrigible Peters. "He was hanged at the Old Bailey in a silk rope for shooting Dr. Johnson." The antiquary vouchsafed no notice of the interruption; but, taking a pinch of snuff, he continued his harangue. "A silver horseshoe, sir, which is due from every scion of royalty who rides across one of his manors; and if you look into the penny county histories, now publishing by an eminent friend of mine, you will find that Langle in county Norfolk was held by one Baldwin per saltum, sufflatum, et petum; that is, he has to come every Christmas into Westminster Hall, there to take a leap, cry hem, and—" "Mr. Simpkinson, A glass of sherry?" cried Tom Ingoldsby, hastily. "Not any, thank you, sir. This Baldwin, surnamed Mrs. Ogleton challenges you, sir. She insists upon it," said Tom still more rapidly, at the same time filling a glass, and forcing it on the sçavant, who, thus arrested in the very crisis of his narrative, received and swallowed the potation as if it were a physic. "What on earth has Miss Simpkinson discovered there?" continued Tom. "Something of interest. See how fast she is writing." The diversion was effectual. Every one looked towards Miss Simpkinson, who, far too ethereal for creature comforts, was seated apart on the dilapidated remains of an altar tomb, committing eagerly to paper something that had strongly impressed her. The air, the eye in a fine frenzy rolling, all betokened that the divine afflatus was come. Her father rose, and stole silently towards her. "What an old bore!" muttered young Ingoldsby, alluding, perhaps, to a slice of brawn which he had just begun to operate upon, but which, from the celerity with which it disappeared, did not seem so very difficult of mastication. But what had become of Seaforth and his fair Caroline all this while? Why, it so happened that they had been simultaneously stricken with the picturesque appearance of one of those high and pointed arches, which the eminent antiquary, Mr. Horsley Curtiss, had described in his Ancient Records, as a Gothic window of the Saxon order; and then the ivy clustered so thickly and so beautifully on the other side, that they went round to look at that; and then their proximity deprived it of half its effect, and so they walked across to a little knoll, 100 yards off, and in crossing a small ravine, they came to what in Ireland they call a bad step, and Charles had to carry his cousin over it; and then when they had to come back, she would not give him the trouble again for the world, so they followed a better but more circuitous route, and there were hedges and ditches in the way, and stiles to get over and gates to get through, so that an hour or more had elapsed before they were able to rejoin the party. "Lassy me," said Miss Julia Simpkinson, "how long have you been gone?" And so they had. The remark was a very just as well as a very natural one. They were gone a long while, and a nice cosy chat they had. And what do you think it was all about, my dear miss? "Oh lassy me! love, no doubt, and the moon, and eyes, and nightingales, and—" "Stay, stay, my sweet young lady. Do not let the fervor of your feelings run away with you. I do not pretend to say, indeed, that one or more of these pretty subjects might not have been introduced; but the most important and leading topic of the conference was Lieutenant Seaforth's breeches. "Caroline," said Charles, "I have had some very odd dreams since I have been at Tappington." "Dreams, have you?" smiled the young lady, arching her taper neck like a swan in pluming. "Dreams, have you?" "Ah, dreams. Or dream, perhaps, I should say; for, though repeated, it was still the same. And what do you imagine was its subject?" "It is impossible for me to divine," said the tongue. "I have not the least difficulty in guessing," said the eye, as plainly as ever eye spoke. "I dreamt—of your great-grandfather." There was a change in the glance. "My great-grandfather?" "Yes, the old Sir Giles, or Sir John, you told me about the other day. He walked into my bedroom in his short cloak of murrey-colored velvet, his long rapier, and his Raleigh-looking hat and feather, just as the picture represents him; but with one exception." "And what was that?" "Why, his lower extremities, which were visible, were those of a skeleton. "Well?" "Well, after taking a turn or two about the room, and looking round him with a wistful air, he came to the bed's foot, stared at me in a manner impossible to describe, and then he laid hold of my pantaloons, whipped his long bony legs into them in a twinkling, and strutting up to the glass, seemed to view himself in it with great complacency. I tried to speak, but in vain. The effort, however, seemed to excite his attention, for, wheeling about, he showed me the grimmest looking death's head you can well imagine, and with an indescribable grin strutted out of the room. "Absurd, Charles! How can you talk such nonsense?" "But, Caroline, the breeches are really gone!" Section 20. Chapter 21 of Humorous Ghost Stories. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Humorous Ghost Stories, selected by Dorothy Scarborough. Chapter 21, The Specter of Tappington, Part 2, from the Ingoldsby Legends, compiled by Richard Barham. On the following morning, contrary to his usual custom, Seaforth was the first person in the breakfast parlour. As no one else was present, he did precisely what 9 young men out of 10 so situated would have done. He walked up to the mantelpiece, established himself upon the rug, and, subducting his coat-tails one under each arm, turned towards the fire that portion of the human frame which it is considered equally indecorous to present to a friend or an enemy. A serious, not to say anxious, expression was visible upon his good-humoured countenance, and his mouth was fast buttoning itself up for an incipient whistle, when little Flo, a tiny spaniel of the Blenheim breed, the pet object of Miss Julia Simpkinson's affections, bounced out from beneath a sofa, and began to bark at his pantaloons. They were cleverly built, of a light grey mixture, a broad stripe of the most vivid scarlet traversing each seam in a perpendicular direction from hip to ankle; in short, the regimental costume of the Royal Bombay Fencibles. The animal, educated in the country, had never seen such a pair of breeches in her life. Omne ignotum pro magnifico. The scarlet streak, inflamed as it was by the reflection of the fire, seemed to act on Flora's nerves as the same color does on those of bulls and turkeys. She advanced at the pas de charge, and her vociferation, like her amazement, was unbounded. A sound kick from the disgusted officer changed its character, and induced a retreat at the very moment when the mistress of the pugnacious quadruped entered to the rescue. "Lassy me, Flo, what is the matter?" cried the sympathizing lady, with a scrutinizing glance levelled at the gentleman. It might as well have lighted on a feather bed. His air of imperturbable unconsciousness defied examination, and as he would not, and Flora could not, expound, that injured individual was compelled to pocket up her wrongs. Others of the household soon dropped in, and clustered round the board dedicated to the most sociable of meals. The urn was paraded hissing hot, and the cups which cheer but not inebriate, steamed redolent of hyson and pekoe; muffins and marmalade, newspapers, and finnan haddies, left little room for observation on the character of Charles's warlike turnout. At length a look from Caroline, followed by a smile that nearly ripened into a titter, caused him to turn abruptly and address his neighbor. it was Miss Simpkinson, who, deeply engaged in sipping her tea and turning over her album, seemed, like a female chrononotonthologos, immersed in cogibundity of cogitation. An interrogatory on the subject of her studies drew from her the confession that she was at that moment employed in putting the finishing touches to a poem inspired by the romantic shades of Bolsover. The entreaties of the company were of course urgent. Mr. Peters, who liked verses, was especially persevering, and Sappho at length compliant. After a preparatory hem and a glance at the mirror to ascertain that her look was sufficiently sentimental, the poetess began. There is a calm, a holy feeling, vulgar minds can never know, o'er the bosom softly stealing, chastened grief, delicious woe. Oh, how sweet at eve regaining yon lone tower's sequestered shade, sadly mute and uncomplaining. Yow! 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 Yelled a hapless sufferer from beneath the table. It was an unlucky hour for quadrupeds; and if "every dog will have his day," he could not have selected a more unpropitious one than this. Mrs. Ogleton, too, had a pet, a favourite pug, whose squab figure, black muzzle, and tortuosity of tail, that curled like a head of celery in a salad bowl, bespoke his Dutch extraction. Yow! 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 Continued the brute, a chorus in which Flo instantly joined. Sooth to say, Pug had more reason to express his dissatisfaction than was given him by the muse of Simpkinson. The other only barked for company. Scarcely had the poetess got through her first stanza, when Tom Ingoldsby, in the enthusiasm of the moment, became so lost in the material world, that, in his abstraction, he unwarily laid his hand on the cock of the urn. Quivering with emotion, he gave it such an unlucky twist, that the full stream of its scalding contents descended on the gingerbread hide of the unlucky Cupid. The confusion was complete; the whole economy of the table disarranged; the company broke up in the most admired disorder; and vulgar minds will never know anything more of Miss Simpkinson's ode till they peruse it in some forthcoming annual. Seaforth profited by the confusion to take the delinquent who had caused this stramash by the arm, and to lead him to the lawn, where he had a word or two for his private ear. The conference between the young gentlemen was neither brief in its duration nor unimportant in its result. The subject was what lawyers call tripartite, embracing the information that Charles Seaforth was over head and ears in love with Tom Ingoldsby's sister; secondly, that the lady had referred him to Papa for his sanction; thirdly, and lastly, his nightly visitations and consequent bereavement. At the first two times Tom smiled suspiciously; at the last he burst out into an absolute guffaw. "Steal your breeches? Miss Bailey over again, by Jove!" shouted Ingoldsby. "But a gentleman, you say? And Sir Giles, too? I'm not sure, Charles, whether I ought not to call you out for aspersing the honor of the family." "Laugh as you will, Tom; be as incredulous as you please. One fact is incontestable: the breeches are gone. Look here, I am reduced to my regimentals; and if these go, tomorrow I must borrow from you." Rochefoucauld says, "There is something in the misfortunes of our very best friends that does not displease us. Assuredly we can, most of us, laugh at their petty inconveniences, till called upon to supply them." Tom composed his features on the instant, and replied with more gravity, as well as with an expletive, which, if my lord mayor had been within hearing might have cost him 5 shillings. There is something very queer in this, after all. The clothes, you say, have positively disappeared. Somebody is playing you a trick. And, 10 to 1, your servant had a hand in it. By the way, I heard something yesterday of his kicking up a bobbery in the kitchen, and seeing a ghost, or something of that kind, himself. Depend upon it, Barney is in the plot. It now struck the lieutenant at once, that the usually buoyant spirits of his attendant had of late been materially sobered down, his loquacity obviously circumscribed, and that he, the said lieutenant, had actually rung his bell 3 several times that very morning before he could procure his attendance. Mr. Maguire was forthwith summoned, and underwent a close examination. The "bobbery" was easily explained. Mr. Oliver Dobbs had hinted his disapprobation of a flirtation carrying on between the gentleman from Munster and the lady from the Rue Saint Honoré. Mademoiselle had boxed Mr. Maguire's ears, and Mr. Maguire had pulled Mademoiselle upon his knee, and the lady had not cried "Mon Dieu!" And Mr. Oliver Dobbs said it was very wrong. And Mrs. Botherby said it was scandalous, and what ought not to be done in any moral kitchen. And Mr. Maguire had got hold of the Honourable Augustus Sucklethumbkin's powder flask, and had put large pinches of the best double Dartford into Mr. Dobbs's tobacco box. And Mr. Dobbs's pipe had exploded, and set fire to Mrs. Botherby's Sunday cap. And Mr. Maguire had put it out with the slop basin, barring the wig. And then they were all so cantankerous, that Barney had gone to take a walk in the garden. And then Mr. Barney had seen a ghost. "A what, you blockhead?" asked Tom Ingoldsby. "Sure then, and it's meself will tell your honor the rights of it," said the ghost seer. "Meself and Miss Pauline, sir, or Miss Pauline and meself, for the ladies comes first anyhow, we got tired of the hobstropolous scrimmaging among the old servants, that didn't know a joke when they seen one, and we went out to look at the comet. That's the Rory Bory alehouse, they calls him in this country, and we walked upon the lawn, and divil of any alehouse there was there at all, and Miss Pauline said it was because of the shrubbery maybe, and why wouldn't we see it better beyonst the tree, so we went to the trees, but sorrow a comet did meself see there, bearing a big ghost instead of it." "A ghost? And what sort of a ghost, Barney?" "Och, then, divil a lie I'll tell your honor. A tall old gentleman he was, all in white, with a shovel on the shoulder of him, and a big torch in his fist. Though what he wanted with that it's meself can't tell, for his eyes were like gig lamps, let alone the moon and the comet, which wasn't there at all. And, Barney, he says to me, 'cause why he knew me, Barney, says he, what is it you're doing with the Colleen there, Barney?' Divil a word did I say. Miss Pauline screeched, and cried murther in French, and ran off with herself; and of course meself was in a mighty hurry after the lady, and had no time to stop palavering with him any way; so I dispersed at once, and the ghost vanished in a flame of fire." Mr. Maguire's account was received with avowed incredulity by both gentlemen, but Barney stuck to his text with unflinching pertinacity. A reference to Mademoiselle was suggested, but abandoned, as neither party had a taste for delicate investigations. "I tell you what, Seaforth," said Ingoldsby, after Barney had received his dismissal, "that there is a trick here, is evident; and Barney's vision may possibly be a part of it. Whether he is most knave or fool, you best know. At all events, I will sit up with you to-night, and see if I can convert my ancestor into a visiting acquaintance. Meanwhile your finger to your lip." 'Twas now the very witching time of night, when churchyards yawn, and graves give up their dead. Gladly would I grace my tale with decent horror, and therefore I do beseech the gentle reader to believe, that if all the succedanea to this mysterious narrative are not in strict keeping, he will ascribe it only to the disgraceful innovations of modern degeneracy upon the sober and dignified habits of our ancestors. I can introduce him, it is true, into an old and high-roofed chamber, its walls covered in 3 sides with black oak wainscoting, adorned with carvings of fruit and flowers long anterior to those of Grinling Gibbons. The 4th side is clothed with a curious remnant of dingy tapestry, once elucidatory of some scriptural history, but of which not even Mrs. Botherby could determine. Mr. Simpkinson, who had examined it carefully, inclined to believe the principal figure to be either Bathsheba or Daniel in the lion's den; while Tom Ingoldsby decided in favor of the king of Bashan. All, however, was conjecture, tradition being silent on the subject. A lofty arched portal led into, and a little arched portal led out of, this apartment. They were opposite each other, and each possessed the security of massy bolts on its interior. The bedstead, too, was not one of yesterday, but manifestly coeval with days ere Seddon's was, and when a good 4-post article was deemed worthy of being a royal bequest. The bed itself, with all the appurtenances of palliasse, mattresses, etc., was of far later date, and looked most incongruously comfortable. The casements, too, with their little diamond-shaped panes and iron binding, had given way to the modern heterodoxy of the sash window. Nor was this all that conspired to ruin the costume, and render the room a meet haunt for such mixed spirits only as could condescend to don at the same time an Elizabethan doublet and Bond Street inexpressibles. With their green morocco slippers on a modern fender, in front of a disgracefully modern grate, sat 2 young gentlemen, clad in shawl-pattern dressing-gowns and black silk stocks, much at variance with the high cane-backed chairs which supported them. A bunch of abomination, called a cigar, reeked in the left-hand corner of the mouth of one, and in the right-hand corner of the mouth of the other, an arrangement happily adapted for the escape of the noxious fumes up the chimney, without that unmerciful funking each other, which a less scientific disposition of the weed would have induced. A small Pembroke table filled up the intervening space between them, sustaining, at each extremity, an elbow and a glass of toddy. Thus in lonely pensive contemplation were the 2 worthies occupied, when the iron tongue of midnight tolled 12. "Ghost time's come," said Ingoldsby, taking from his waistcoat pocket a watch like a gold half-crown, and consulting it as though he suspected the turret clock over the stables of mendacity. "Hush!" said Charles. "Did I not hear a footstep?" There was a pause. There was a footstep. It sounded distinctly. It reached the door. It hesitated, stopped, and passed on. Tom darted across the room, threw open the door, and became aware of Mrs. Botherby toddling to her chamber, at the other end of the gallery, after dosing one of the housemaids with an approved julep from the Countess of Kent's choice manual. "Good night, sir," said Mrs. Botherby. "Go to the devil," said the disappointed ghost hunter. An hour, 2, rolled on, and still no spectral visitation, nor did aught intervene to make night hideous; and when the turret clock sounded at length the hour of 3, Ingoldsby, whose patience and grog were alike exhausted, sprang from his chair, saying: "This is all infernal nonsense, my good fellow. Deuce of any ghost shall we see to night. It's long past the canonical hour. I'm off to bed, and as to your breeches, I'll insure them for the next 24 hours at least, at the price of the buckram." "Certainly. Oh, thank'ee. To be sure," stammered Charles, rousing himself from a reverie, which had degenerated into an absolute snooze. "Good night, my boy. Bolt the door behind me, and defy the Pope, the devil, and the Pretender." Seaforth followed his friend's advice, and the next morning came down to breakfast dressed in the habiliments of the preceding day. The charm was broken, the demon defeated. The light greys with the red stripe down the seam were yet in rerum natura, and adorned the person of their lawful proprietor. Tom felicitated himself and his partner of the watch on the result of their vigilance; but there is a rustic adage, which warns us against self-congratulation before we are quite out of the wood. Seaforth was yet within its verge. A rap at Tom Ingoldsby's door the following morning startled him as he was shaving. He cut his chin. "Come in, and be d to you," said the martyr, pressing his thumb on the scarified epidermis. The door opened, and exhibited Mr. Barney Maguire. "Well, Barney, what is it?" quoth the sufferer, adopting the vernacular of his visitant. "The master, sir." "Well, what does he want?" "The loanst of a breeches, plaze your honor." "Why, you don't mean to tell me? By heaven, this is too good!" shouted Tom, bursting into a fit of uncontrollable laughter. "Why, Barney, you don't mean to say the ghost has got them again?" Mr. Maguire did not respond to the young squire's risibility. The cast of his countenance was decidedly serious. "Faith, then, it's gone they are sure enough. Hasn't meself been looking over the bed, and under the bed, and in the bed, for the matter of that, and divil a ha'porth of breeches is there to the fore at all. I'm bothered entirely." "Harkee, Mr. Barney," said Tom, incautiously removing his thumb, and letting a crimson stream incarnadine the multitudinous lather that plastered his throat. "This may be all very well with your master, but you don't humbug me, sir. Tell me instantly what have you done with the clothes?" This abrupt transition from lively to severe certainly took Maguire by surprise, and he seemed for an instant as much disconcerted as it is possible to disconcert an Irish gentleman's gentleman. "Me? Is it meself, then, that's the ghost to your honor's thinking?" he said after a moment's pause, and with a slight shade of indignation in his tones. "Is it I would stale the master's things? And what would I do with them?" "That you best know. What your purpose is I can't guess, for I don't think you mean to 'stale' them, as you call it; but that you are concerned in their disappearance, I am satisfied. Confound this blood! Give me a towel, Barney." Maguire acquitted himself of the commission. "As I've a soul, your honor," said he, solemnly, "little it is meself knows of the matter; and after what I seen—" "What you've seen? Why, what have you seen? Barney, I don't want to inquire into your flirtations; but don't suppose you can palm off your saucer eyes and gig lamps upon me." "Then, as sure as your honor's standing there, I saw him; and why wouldn't I, when Miss Pauline was to the fore as well as meself, and—" "Get along with your nonsense. Leave the room, sir." "But the master," said Barney, imploringly, "and without a breeches? Sure he'll be catching cold." "Take that, rascal!" replied Ingoldsby, throwing a pair of pantaloons at, rather than to, him. "But don't suppose, sir, you shall carry on your tricks here with impunity. Recollect there is such a thing as a treadmill, and that my father is a county magistrate." Barney's eye flashed fire; he stood erect, and was about to speak; but, mastering himself, not without an effort, he took up the garment, and left the room as perpendicular as a Quaker. "Ingoldsby," said Charles Seaforth, after breakfast, "this is now past a joke. To-day is the last of my stay; for, notwithstanding the ties which detain me, common decency obliges me to visit home after so long an absence. I shall come to an immediate explanation with your father on the subject nearest my heart, and depart while I have a change of dress left. On his answer will my return depend. In the meantime tell me candidly, I ask it in all seriousness, and as a friend, am I not a dupe to your well-known propensity to hoaxing? Have you not a hand in—" "No, by heaven, Seaforth! I see what you mean. On my honor, I am as much mystified as yourself; and if your servant—" "Not he. If there be a trick, he at least is not privy to it." "If there be a trick? Why, Charles, do you think—" "I know not what to think, Tom. As surely as you are a living man, so surely did that spectral anatomy visit my room again last night, grin in my face, and walk away with my trousers; nor was I able to spring from my bed, or break the chain which seemed to bind me to my pillow." "Seaforth!" said Ingoldsby, after a short pause. "I will; but hush, here are the girls and my father. I will carry off the females, and leave you a clear field with the governor; carry your point with him, and we will talk about your breeches afterwards." Tom's diversion was successful. He carried off the ladies en masse to look at a remarkable specimen of the class Dodecandria monogynea, which they could not find; while Seaforth marched boldly up to the encounter, and carried the governor's outworks by coup de main. I shall not stop to describe the progress of the attack; suffice it that it was as successful as could have been wished, and that Seaforth was referred back again to the lady. The happy lover was off at a tangent; the botanical party was soon overtaken; and the arm of Caroline, whom a vain endeavor to spell out the Linnean name of a daffydowndilly had detained a little in the rear of the others, was soon firmly locked in his own. What was the world to them, its noise, its nonsense and its breeches all? Seaforth was in seventh heaven. He retired to his room that night as happy as if no such thing as a goblin had ever been heard of, and personal chattels were as well fenced in by law as real property. Not so Tom Ingoldsby. The mystery, for mystery there evidently was, had not only piqued his curiosity, but ruffled his temper. The watch of the previous night had been unsuccessful, probably because it was undisguised. To-night he would ensconce himself, not indeed behind the arras, for the little that remained was, as we have seen, nailed to the wall, but in a little closet which opened from one corner of the room, and by leaving the door ajar, would give to its occupant a view of all that might pass in the apartment. Here did the young ghost hunter take up a position, with a good stout sapling under his arm, a full half hour before Seaforth retired for the night. Not even his friend did he let into his confidence, fully determined that if his plan did not succeed, the failure should be attributed to himself alone. At the usual hour of separation for the night, Tom saw, from his concealment, the lieutenant enter his room, and after taking a few turns in it, with an expression so joyous as to betoken that his thoughts were mainly occupied by his approaching happiness, proceeded slowly to disrobe himself. The coat, the waistcoat, the black silk stock, were gradually discarded. The green morocco slippers were kicked off, and then, his countenance grew grave. It seemed to occur to him all at once that this was his last stake. Nay, that the very breeches he had on were not his own. That tomorrow morning was his last, and that if he lost them... A glance showed that his mind was made up. He replaced the single button he had just subducted, and threw himself upon the bed in a state of transition, half chrysalis, half grub. Wearily did Tom Ingoldsby watch the sleeper by the flickering light of the night lamp, till the clock striking 1, induced him to increase the narrow opening which he had left for the purpose of observation. The motion, slight as it was, seemed to attract Charles's attention; for he raised himself suddenly to a sitting posture, listened for a moment, then stood upright upon the floor. Ingoldsby was on the point of discovering himself, when, the light flashing full upon his friend's countenance, he perceived that, though his eyes were open, their sense was shut; that he was yet under the influence of sleep. Seaforth advanced slowly to the toilet, lit his candle at the lamp that stood on it, then, going back to the bed's foot, appeared to search eagerly for something which he could not find. For a few moments he seemed restless and uneasy, walking round the apartment and examining the chairs, till, coming fully in front of a large swing glass that flanked the dressing table, he paused as if contemplating his figure in it. He now returned towards the bed, put on his slippers, and, with cautious and stealthy steps, proceeded towards the little arched doorway that opened on the private staircase. As he drew the bolt, Tom Ingoldsby emerged from his hiding place; but the sleep-walker heard him not. He proceeded softly downstairs, followed at a due distance by his friend, opened the door which led out upon the gardens, and stood at once among the thickest of the shrubs, which there clustered round the base of a corner turret, and screened the postern from common observation. At this moment Ingoldsby had nearly spoilt all by making a false step. The sound attracted Seaforth's attention. He paused and turned; and, as the full moon shed her light directly upon his pale and troubled features, Tom marked, almost with dismay, the fixed and rayless appearance of his eyes. There was no speculation in those orbs, that he did glare withal. The perfect stillness preserved by his follower seemed to reassure him. He turned aside, and from the midst of the thickest laurustinus drew forth a gardener's spade, shouldering which he proceeded with great rapidity into the midst of the shrubbery. Arrived at a certain point where the earth seemed to have been recently disturbed, he set himself heartily to the task of digging, till, having thrown up several shovelfuls of mould, he stopped, flung down his tool, and very composedly began to disencumber himself of his pantaloons. Up to this moment Tom had watched him with a wary eye. He now advanced cautiously, and, as his friend was busily engaged in disentangling himself from his garment, made himself master of the spade. Seaforth, meanwhile, had accomplished his purpose. He stood for a moment with his streamers waving in the wind, occupied in carefully rolling up the small clothes into as compact a form as possible, and all heedless of the breath of heaven, which might certainly be supposed at such a moment, and in such a plight, to visit his frame too roughly. He was in the act of stooping low to deposit the pantaloons in the grave which he had been digging for them, when Tom Ingoldsby came close behind him, and with the flat side of the spade. The shock was effectual. Never again was Lieutenant Seaforth known to act the part of a somnambulist. One by one, his breeches, his trousers, his pantaloons, his silk-necked tights, his patent cords, his showy greys with the broad red stripe of the Bombay fencibles were brought to light, rescued from the grave in which they had been buried, like the strata of a Christmas pie, and after having been well aired by Mrs. Botherby, became once again effective. The family, the ladies especially, laughed, the Peterses laughed, the Simpkinsons laughed, Barney Maguire cried "Botheration!" and Mademoiselle Pauline, "Mon Dieu!" Charles Seaforth, unable to face the quizzing which awaited him on all sides, started off 2 hours earlier than he had proposed. He soon returned, however, and having, at his father-in-law's request, given up the occupation of Rajah hunting and shooting nabobs, led his blushing bride to the altar. Mr. Simpkinson from Bath did not attend the ceremony, being engaged at the Grand Junction meeting of Scavans, then congregating from all parts of the known world in the city of Dublin. His essay, demonstrating that the globe is a great custard, whipped into coagulation by whirlwinds and cooked by electricity, a little too much baked in the Isle of Portland, and thought underdone about the Bog of Allen, was highly spoken of, and narrowly escaped obtaining a Bridgewater prize. Miss Simpkinson and her sister acted as bridesmaids on the occasion. The former wrote an epithalamium, and the latter cried "Lassy me" at the clergyman's wig. Some years have since rolled on. The union has been crowned with 2 or 3 tidy little offshoots from the family tree, of whom Master Neddy is grandpapa's darling, and Marianne mamma's particular sock. I shall only add, that Mr. and Mrs. Seaforth are living together quite as happily as 2 good-hearted, good-tempered bodies, very fond of each other, can possibly do, and that, since the day of his marriage, Charles has shown no disposition to jump out of bed, or ramble out of doors o' nights; though from his entire devotion to every wish and whim of his young wife, Tom insinuates that the fair Caroline does still occasionally take advantage of it so far as to slip on the breeches. Chapter 21.
Chapter 22 of Humorous Ghost Stories. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Humorous Ghost Stories, selected by Dorothy Scarborough. Chapter 22. In the Barn, by Burges Johnson. From the Century Magazine, June 1920, by permission of the Century Company and Burges Johnson. The moment we had entered the barn, I regretted the rash good nature which prompted me to consent to the plans of those vivacious young students. Miss Anstell and Miss Royce, and 1 or 2 others, often leaders in student mischief, I suspect were the first to enter, and they amused themselves by hiding in the darkness, and greeting the rest of our party as we entered with sundry shrieks and moans such as are commonly attributed to ghosts. My wife and I brought up the rear, carrying the 2 farm lanterns. She had selected the place after an amused consideration of the question, and I confess I hardly approved her judgment. But she is native to this part of the country, and she had assured us that there were some vague traditions hanging about the building that made it most suitable for our purposes. It was a musty old place, without even as much tidiness as is usually found in barns, and there was a dank smell about it, as though generations of hay-mows had decayed there. There were holes in the floor, and in the dusk of early evening it was necessary for us to pick our way with the greatest care. It occurred to me then, in a premonitory sort of way, that if some young woman student sprained her ankle in this absurd environment, I should be most embarrassed to explain it. Apparently it was a hay barn whose vague dimensions were lost in shadow. Rafters crossed its width about 20 feet above our heads, and here and there a few boards lay across the rafters, furnishing foothold for anyone who might wish to operate the ancient pulley that was doubtless used once for lifting bales. The northern half of the floor was covered with hay to a depth of 2 or 3 feet. How long it had actually been there I cannot imagine. It was extremely dusty, and I feared a recurrence of my old enemy hay fever, but it was too late to offer objection on such grounds, and my wife and I followed our chattering guides, who disposed themselves here and there on this ancient bed of hay, and insisted that we should find places in the center of their circle. At my suggestion, the 2 farm lanterns had been left at a suitable distance, in fact quite at the other side of the barn, and our only light came from the rapidly falling twilight of outdoors, which found its way through a little window and sundry cracks high in the eaves above the rafters. There was something about the place, now that we were settled and no longer occupied with adjustments of comfort, that subdued our spirits, and it was with much less hilarity that the young people united in demanding a story. I looked across at my wife, whose face was faintly visible within the circle. I thought that even in the half-light I glimpsed the same expression of amused incredulity which she had worn earlier in the day, when I had yielded to the importunities of your deputation of my students for this ghost-story party on the eve of a holiday. There is no reason, I thought to myself, repeating the phrases I had used then, there is no reason why I should not tell a ghost story. True, I had never done so before, but the literary attainments which have enabled me to perfect my recent treatise upon the disuse of the comma are quite equal to impromptu experimentation in the field of psychic phenomena. I was aware that the young people themselves hardly expected serious acquiescence, and that too stimulated me. I cleared my throat in a prefatory manner, and silence fell upon the group. A light breeze had risen outside, and the timbers of the barn creaked persistently. From the shadows almost directly overhead there came a faint clanking. It was evidently caused by the rusty pulley wheel which I had observed there as we entered. An iron hook at the end of an ancient rope still depended from it, and swung in the lightly stirring air several feet above our heads, directly over the center of our circle. Some curious combination of influences, perhaps the atmosphere of the place, added to the stimulation of the faintly discernible faces around me, and my impulse to prove my own ability in this untried field of narration gave me a sudden sense of being inspired. I found myself voicing fancies as though they were facts, and readily including imaginary names and data, which certainly were not in any way premeditated. "This barn stands on the old Creed place," I began. "Peter Creed was its last owner, but I suppose that it has always been and always will be known as the Turner barn. A few yards away to the south you will find the crumbling brickwork and gaping hollows of an old foundation, now overgrown with weeds that almost conceal a few charred timbers. That is all that is left of the old Ashley Turner house." I cleared my throat again, not through any effort to gain time for my thoughts, but to feel for a moment the satisfaction arising from the intent attitude of my audience, particularly my wife, who had leaned forward and was looking at me with an expression of startled surprise. "Ashley Turner must have had a pretty fine-looking farm here 30 years or so ago," I continued, "when he brought his wife to it. This barn was new then. But he was a ne'er-do-well, with nothing to be said in his favor unless you admit his fame as a practical joker. Strange how the ne'er-do-well is often equipped with an extravagant sense of humor. Turner had a considerable retinue among the riff-raff boys of the neighborhood, who made this barn a noisy rendezvous and followed his hints in much whimsical mischief. But he committed most of his practical jokes when drunk, and in his sober moments He abused his family and let his wife struggle to keep up the acres, assisted only by a half-competent man of all work. Finally, he took to roving. No one knew how he got pocket money. His wife could not have given him any. Then someone discovered that he was going over to Creed's now and then, and everything was explained. This concise data of mine was evidently not holding the close attention of my youthful audience. They annoyed me by frequent pranks and whisperings. No one could have been more surprised at my glibness than I myself, except perhaps my wife, whose attitude of strained attention had not relaxed. I resume my story. Peter Creed was a good old-fashioned usurer of the worst type. He went to church regularly one day in the week, and gouged his neighbors, any that he could get into his clutches, on the other 6. He must have been lending Turner drinking money, and everyone knew what the security must be. At last there came a day when the long-suffering wife revolted. Turner had come home extra drunk, and in his most maudlin humor. Probably he attempted some drunken prank upon his overtaxed helpmate. Old Ike, the hired man, said that he thought Turner had rigged up some scare for her in the barn, and that he had never heard anything so much like straight talking from his mistress, either before or since. And he was working in the woodshed at the time, with the door shut. Shortly after that tirade, Ashley Turner disappeared, and no one saw or heard of him or thought about him for a couple of years, except when the sight of his tired-looking wife and scrawny children revived the recollection. At last, on a certain autumn day, old Peter Creed turned up here at the Turner place. I imagine Mrs. Turner knew what was in store for her when his rusty buggy came in sight around the corner of the barn. At any rate, she made no protest, and listened meekly to his curt statement that he held an overdue mortgage with plenty of back interest owing, and it was time for her to go. She went. Neither she nor anyone else doubted Creed's rights in the matter, and after all, I believe it's got a better home for her somewhere in the long run. I paused here in my narration to draw breath and readjust my leg, which had become cramped. There was a general readjustment and shifting of position with some levity. It was darker now. The rafters above us were invisible, and the faces about me looked oddly white against the shadowy background. After a moment or two of delay, I cleared my throat sharply and continued. Old Creed came thus into possession of this place, just as he had come to own a dozen others in the county. He usually lived on one until he was able to sell it at a good profit over his investment. So he settled down in the Turner house and kept old Ike because he worked for little or nothing. But he seemed to have a hard time finding a purchaser. It must have been about a year later when an unexpected thing happened. Creed had come out here to the barn to lock up. He always did that himself, when he noticed something unusual about the haymow. This haymow, which stood then about 6 feet above the barn floor, he looked closer through the dusk and saw a pair of boots, went nearer, and found that they fitted to a pair of human legs whose owner was sound asleep in his hay. Creed picked up a short stick and beat on one boot. "Get out of here," he said, "or I'll have you locked up." The sleeper woke in slow fashion, sat up, grinned, and said, "Hello, Peter Creed." It was Ashley Turner, beyond question. Creed stepped back a pace or two and seemed at a loss for words. An object slipped from Turner's pocket as he moved, slid along the hay, and fell to the barn floor. It was a half-filled whiskey flask. No one knows full details of the conversation that ensued, of course. Such little as I am able to tell you of what was said and done comes through old Ike, who watched from a safe distance outside the barn, ready to act at a moment's notice as best suited his own safety and welfare. Of one thing Ike was certain. Creed lacked his usual browbeating manner. He was apparently struggling to assume an unwonted friendliness. Turner was very drunk, but triumphant, and his satisfaction over what he must have felt was the practical joke of his life seemed to make him friendly. "I kept 'em all right," he said again and again. "I've got the proof. I wasn't working for nothing all these months. I ain't fool enough yet to throw away papers, even when I'm drunk." To the watchful Ike's astonishment, Creed evidently tried to persuade him to come into the house for something to eat. Turner slid off the haymow, found his steps too unsteady, laughed foolishly and suggested that Creed bring some food to him there. "Guess I've got a right to sleep in the barn or house, whichever I want," he said, leering into Creed's face. The old usurer stood there for a few minutes, eyeing Turner thoughtfully. Then he actually gave him a shoulder back onto the hay, said something about finding a snack of supper, and started out of the barn. In the doorway he turned, looked back, and then walked over to the edge of the mow, groped on the floor until he found the whiskey flask, picked it up, tossed it into Turner's lap, and stumbled out of the barn again. I was becoming interested in my own story, and somewhat pleased with the fluency of it. But my audience annoyed me. There was intermittent whispering, with some laughter, and I inferred that one or another would occasionally stimulate this inattention by tickling a companion with a straw. Miss Anstell, who is so frivolous by nature that I sometimes question her right to a place in my classroom, I even suspected of irritating the back of my own neck in the same fashion. Naturally, I ignored it. Peter Creed, I repeated, went into the house. Ike hung around the barn waiting. He was frankly curious. In a few minutes his employer reappeared, carrying a plate heaped with an assortment of scraps. Ike peered and listened then without compunction. "It's the best I've got," he heard Creed say grudgingly. Turner's tones were now more drunkenly belligerent. "It had better be," he said loudly, "and I'll take the best bed after tonight." Evidently he was eating and muttering between mouthfuls. "You might have brought me another bottle." "I did," said Creed, to the listening Ike's great astonishment. Turner laughed immoderately. A long silence followed. Turner was either eating or drinking, and then he spoke again, more thickly and drowsily. "Damn unpleasant, that rope. Why don't you haul it up out of my way?" "It don't hurt you any," said Creed. "Don't you wish it would?" said Turner with drunken shrewdness. "But I don't like it. Haul it away." "I will," said Creed. There was a longer silence, and then there came an intermittent rasping sound. A moment later Creed came suddenly from the barn. Ike fumbled with a large rake and made as though to hang it on its accustomed peg near the barn door. Creed eyed him sharply. "Get along to bed," he ordered, and Ike obeyed. That was a Saturday night. On Sunday morning Ike went to the barn later than usual and hesitatingly. Even then he was first to enter. He found the drunkard's body hanging here over the mow, just about where we are sitting, stark and cold. It was a gruesome end to a miserable homecoming. My audience was quiet enough now. Miss Anstell and one or two others giggled loudly, but it was obviously forced, and found no further echo. The breeze which had sprung up some time before was producing strange creakings and raspings in the old timbers, and the pulley wheel far above us clanked with a dismal repetitious sound like the tolling of a cracked bell. I waited a moment, well satisfied with the effect, and then continued. The coroner's jury found it suicide, though some shook their heads meaningly. Turner had apparently sobered up enough to stand, and making a simple loop around his neck by catching the rope through its own hook, had then slid off the mow. The rope, which went over the pulley wheel up there in the roof, ran out through a window under the eaves, and was made fast near the barn door outside, where anyone could haul on it. Creed testified the knot was one he had tied many days before. Ike was a timorous old man with a wholesome fear of his employer, and he supported the testimony and made no reference to his eavesdropping of the previous evening, though he heard Creed swear before the jury that he did not recognize the tramp he had fed and lodged. There were no papers in Turner's pockets, only a few coins and a marked pocket-knife that gave the first clue to his identity. A few of the neighbors said that it was a fitting end, and that the verdict was a just one. Nevertheless, whisperings began and increased. People avoided Creed and the neighborhood. Rumors grew that the barn was haunted. Passers-by on the road after dark said they heard the old pulley wheel clanking when no breeze stirred, much as you hear it now. Some claimed to have heard maudlin laughter. Possible purchasers were frightened away, and Creed grew more and more solitary and misanthropic. Old Ike hung on, heaven knows why, though I suppose Creed paid him some sort of wage. Rumors grew. Folks said that neither Ike nor Creed entered this barn after a time, and no hay was put in, though Creed would not have been Creed if he had not sold off the bulk of what he had, ghost or no ghost. I can imagine him slowly forking it out alone, daytimes, and the amount of hay still here proves that even he finally lost courage. I paused a moment, but though there was much uneasy stirring about, and the dismal clanking directly above us was incessant, no one of my audience spoke. It was wholly dark now, and I think all had drawn closer together. About 10 years ago people began calling Creed crazy. Here I was forced to interrupt my own story. I shall have to ask you, Miss Anstell, to stop annoying me. I have been aware for some moments that you're brushing my head with a straw, but I have ignored it for the sake of the others. Out of the darkness came Miss Anstell's voice, protesting earnestly, and I realized from the direction of the sound that in the general readjustment she must have settled down in the very center of our circle, and could not be the one at fault. One of the others was childish enough to simulate a mocking burst of raucous laughter, but I chose to ignore it. "Very well," said I graciously. "Shall I go on?" "Go on," echoed a subdued chorus. "It was the night of the 28th of May, 10 years ago." "Not the 28th," broke in my wife's voice sharply. "That is today's date." There was a note in her voice that I hardly recognized, but it indicated that she was in some way affected by my narration, and I felt a distinct sense of triumph. "It was the night of May 28th," I repeated firmly. "Are you making up this story?" My wife's voice continued, still with that same odd tone. "I am, my dear, and you are interrupting it." "But an Ashley Turner and later a Peter Creed owned this place," she persisted, almost in a whisper, "and I'm sure you never heard of them." I confess that I might wisely have broken off my story then and called for a light. There had been an hysterical note in my wife's voice, and I was startled at her words, for I had no conscious recollection of either name. Yet I felt a resultant exhilaration. Our lanterns had grown strangely dim, though I was certain both had been recently trimmed and filled, and from their far corner of the barn they threw no light whatever into our circle. I faced an utter blackness. "On that night," said I, "old Ike was wakened by sounds as of someone fumbling to unbar and open the house door. It was an unwonted hour, and he peered from the window of his little room. By the dim starlight, it was just before dawn, he could see all the open yard and roadway before the house, with the great barn looming like a black and sinister shadow as its farther barrier. Crossing this space he saw the figure of Peter Creed, grotesquely stooped and old in the obscuring gloom, moving slowly, almost gropingly, and yet directly, as though impelled, toward the barn's overwhelming shadow. Slowly he unbarred the great door, swung it open, and entered the blacker shadows it concealed. The door closed after him. Ike, in his secure post of observation, did not stir. He could not. Even to his crude imagining, there was something utterly horrible in the thought of Creed alone at that hour, in just such black darkness as this, with a great timbered chamber haunted at least by its dread memories. He could only wait, tense and fearful of he knew not what. A shriek that pierced the silence relaxed his tension, bringing almost a sense of relief, so definite had been his expectancy. But it was a burst of shrill laughter, ribald, uncanny, undeniable, accompanying this shriek, that gave him power of motion. He ran half naked, a quarter of a mile, to the nearest neighbors, and told his story. They found Creed hanging, the rope hooked simply around his neck. It was a silent jury that filed from the barn that morning after viewing the body. "Suicide," said they, after Ike, shivering and stammering, had testified, harking back to the untold evidence of that other morning years before. Yes, Creed was dead, with a terrible look on his wizened face, and the dusty old rope ran through its pulley wheel and was fast to a beam high above. "He must have climbed to the beam, made the rope fast, and jumped," said the foreman solemnly. "He must have, repeated the man, parrot-like, while the sweat stood out on his forehead, "because there wasn't no other way. But as God is my judge, the knot in the rope and the dust on the beam ain't been disturbed for years." At this dramatic climax there was an audible sigh from my audience. I sat quietly for a time, content to allow the silence and the atmosphere of the place, which actually seemed surcharged with influences not of my creation, to add to the effect my story had caused. There was scarcely a movement in our circle, of that I felt sure, and yet once more, out of the almost tangible darkness above me, something seemed to reach down and brush against my head. A slight motion of air, sufficient to disturb my rather scanty locks, was additional proof that I was the butt of some prank that had just missed its objective. Then, with a fearful suddenness, close to my ear burst a shrill discord of laughter, so uncanny and so unlike the usual sound of student merriment that I started up, half wondering if I had heard it. Almost immediately after it, the heavy darkness was torn again by a shriek, so terrible in its intensity as completely to differentiate it from the other cries which followed. "Bring a light!" cried a voice that I recognized as that of my wife, though strangely distorted by emotion. There was a great confusion. Young women struggled from their places and impeded one another in the darkness. But finally, and it seemed an unbearable delay, someone brought a single lantern. Its frail light revealed Miss Anstell, half upright from her place in the center of our circle, my wife's arm sustaining her weight. Her face, as well as I could see it, seemed darkened and distorted, and when we forced her clutching hands away from her bared throat, we could see, even in that light, the marks of an angry, throttling scar entirely encircling it. Just above her head, the old pulley rope swayed menacingly in the faint breeze. My recollection is even now confused as to the following moments and our stumbling escape from that gruesome spot. Miss Anstell is now at her home, recovering from what her physician calls mental shock. My wife will not speak of it. The questions I would ask her are checked on my lips by the look of utter terror in her eyes. As I have confessed to you, my own philosophy is hard put to it to withstand not so much the community attitude toward what they are pleased to call my taste in practical joking, but to assemble and adjust the facts of my experience. End of chapter 22. Chapter 23 of Humorous Ghost Stories. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Humorous Ghost Stories, selected by Dorothy Scarborough. Chapter 23. A Shady Plot, by Elsie Brown. This story was submitted as a class exercise in one of my short story classes at Columbia University. At my request, the author, Elsie Brown, contributed it to this volume. So I sat down to write a ghost story. Jenkins was responsible. "Halleck," he had said to me, "give us another on the supernatural this time, something to give him the horrors. That's what the public wants, and your ghosts are live propositions." Well, I was in no position to contradict Jenkins, for as yet his magazine had been the only one to print my stuff. So I had said, "Precisely," in the deepest voice I was capable of, and had gone out. I hadn't the shade of an idea, but at the time that didn't worry me in the least. You see, I had often been like that before, and in the end things had always come my way. I didn't in the least know how or why. It had all been rather mysterious. You understand, I didn't specialize in ghost stories, but more or less they seemed to specialize in me. A ghost story had been the first fiction I had written. Curious how that idea for a plot had come to me out of nowhere, after I had chased inspiration in vain for months. Even now, whenever Jenkins wanted a ghost, he called on me, and I had never found it healthy to contradict Jenkins. Jenkins always seemed to have an uncanny knowledge as to when the landlord or the grocer were pestering me, and he dunned me for a ghost, and somehow I'd always been able to dig one up for him. So I'd begun to get a bit cocky as to my ability. So I went home and sat down before my desk and sucked at the end of my pencil and waited. But nothing happened. Pretty soon my mind began to wander off on other things, decidedly unghostly and material things, such as my wife's shopping, and how on earth was I going to cure her of her alarming tendency to take every new fad that came along and work her to death. But I realized that would never get me any place, so I went back to staring at the ceiling. "This writing business is delightful, isn't it?" I said sarcastically at last, out loud too. You see, I had reached the stage of imbecility when I was talking to myself. "Yes," said a voice at the other end of the room, "I should say it is." I admit I jumped. Then I looked around. It was twilight by this time, and I had forgotten to turn on the lamp. The other end of the room was full of shadows and furniture. I sat staring at it, and presently noticed something just taking shape. It was exactly like watching one of those moving picture cartoons being put together. First an arm came out, then a bit of sleeve of a stiff white shirtwaist, then a leg and a plaid skirt, until at last there she was complete, whoever she was. She was long and angular, with enormous fishy eyes behind big bone-rimmed spectacles, and her hair was in a tight wad at the back of her head. Yes, I seemed able to see right through her head, and the jaw, well, it looked so solid that for the moment I began to doubt my very own senses, and believe she was real after all. She came over, stood in front of me, and glared. Yes, positively glared down at me, although to my knowledge I had never laid eyes on the woman before, to say nothing of giving her cause to look at me like that. I sat still, feeling pretty helpless, I can tell you, and at last she barked. "What are you gaping at?" I swallowed, though I hadn't been chewing anything. "Nothing," I said, "absolutely nothing, my dear lady. I was merely waiting for you to tell me why you had come. And, excuse me, but do you always come in sections like this? I should think your parts might get mixed up sometimes." "Didn't you send for me?" she crisped. Imagine how I felt at that. "Why, no, I don't seem to remember." "Look here, haven't you been calling on heaven and earth all afternoon to help you write a story?" I nodded, and then a possible explanation occurred to me, and my spine got cold. Suppose this was the ghost of a stenographer applying for a job. I had had an advertisement in the paper recently. I opened my mouth to explain that the position was filled, and permanently so, but she stopped me. "And when I got back to the office from my last case and was ready for you, didn't you switch off to something else and sit there driveling, so I couldn't attract your attention until just now?" I'm very sorry, really." "Well, you needn't be, because I just came to tell you to stop bothering us for assistance. You ain't going to get it. We're going on strike." "What?" "You don't have to yell at me." I didn't mean to yell," I said humbly, "but I'm afraid I didn't quite understand you. You said you were—" "Going on strike. Don't you know what a strike is? Not another plot do you get from us." I stared at her and wet my lips. Is that where they've been coming from?" "Of course, where else?" "But my ghosts aren't a bit like you." "If they were, people wouldn't believe in them." She draped herself on the top of my desk, among the pens and ink bottles, and leaned towards me. "In the other life I used to write." "You did?" She nodded. "But that has nothing to do with my present form. It might have, but I gave it up at last for that very reason, and went to work as a reader on a magazine." She sighed and rubbed the end of her long eagle nose with a reminiscent finger. "Those were terrible days. The memory of them made me mistake purgatory for paradise, and at last, when I attained my present state of being, I made up my mind that something should be done. I found others who had suffered similarly, and between us we organized the Writers' Inspiration Bureau. We scout around until we find a writer without ideas and with a mind soft enough to accept impression, and the case is brought to the attention of the main office, and one of us is assigned to it. When that case is finished, we bring in a report. But I never saw you before, and you wouldn't have this time if I hadn't come to announce the strike. Many a time I've leaned on your shoulder when you thought you were thinking hard." I groaned and clutched my hair. The very idea of that horrible scarecrow so much as touching me! And wouldn't my wife be shocked? I shivered. But," she continued, "that's at an end. We've been called out of our beds a little too often in recent years, and now we're through." "But, my dear madam, I assure you I have had nothing to do with that. I hope I'm properly grateful and all that, you see." "Oh, it isn't you," she explained patronizingly. "It's those Ouija board fanatics. There was a time when we had nothing much to occupy us, and used to haunt a little on the side, purely for amusement. But not any more. We've had to give up haunting almost entirely. We sit at a desk and answer questions now, and such questions." She shook her head hopelessly, and taking off her glasses, wiped them and put them back on her nose again. "But what have I got to do with this?" She gave me a pitying look and rose. "You're to exert your influence, get all your friends and acquaintances to stop using the Ouija board, and then we'll start helping you to write." "But—" There was a footstep outside my door. "John! Oh, John!" called the voice of my wife. I waved my arms at the ghost with something of the motion of a beginner when learning to swim. "Madam, I must ask you to leave, and at once. Consider the impression if you were seen here." The ghost nodded, and began very sensibly, I thought, to demobilize and evaporate. First the brogans on her feet grew misty until I could see the floor through them. Then the affection spread to her knees and gradually extended upward. By this time my wife was opening the door. "Don't forget the strike," she repeated, while her lower jaw began to disintegrate, and as my Lavina crossed the room to me, the last vestige of her ear faded into space. "John, why in the world are you sitting in the dark?" "Just thinking, my dear." "Thinking rubbish! You were talking out loud." I remained silent while she lit the lamps, thankful that her back was turned to me. When I am nervous or excited, there is a muscle in my face that starts to twitch, and this pulls up one corner of my mouth and gives the appearance of an idiotic grin. So far I had managed to conceal this affliction from Lavinia. "You know, I bought the loveliest thing this afternoon. Everybody's wild over them." I remembered her craze for taking up new fads, and a premonitory chill crept up the back of my neck. It isn't," I began, and stopped. I simply couldn't ask. The possibility was too horrible. "You'd never guess in the world. It's the duckiest, darlingest Ouija board, and so cheap. I got it at a bargain sale. Why, what's the matter, John?" I felt things slipping. "Nothing," I said, and looked around for the ghost. Suppose she had lingered, and upon hearing what my wife had said, should suddenly appear. Like all sensitive women, Lavinia was subject to hysterics. "But you look so funny." I always do when I'm interested," I gulped. "But don't you think that was a foolish thing to buy?" "Foolish? Oh, John, foolish! And after me getting it for you." "For me? What do you mean?" "To help you write your stories. Why, for instance, suppose you wanted to write an historical novel. You wouldn't have to wear your eyes out over those musty old books in the public library. All you'd have to do would be to get out your Ouija and talk to Napoleon, or William the Conqueror, or Helen of Troy. Well, maybe not Helen. Anyhow, you'd have all the local color you'd need, and without a speck of trouble. And think how easy writing your short stories will be now. But, Lavinia, you surely don't believe in Ouija boards?" "I don't know, John. They're awfully thrilling." She had seated herself on the arm of my chair, and was looking dreamily across the room. I started and turned around. There was nothing there, and I sank back with relief. So far, so good. "Oh, certainly they're thrilling, all right. That's just it. They're a darn sight too thrilling. They're positively devilish. Now, Lavinia, you have plenty of sense, and I want you to get rid of that thing just as soon as you can. Take it back and get something else." My wife crossed her knees and stared at me through narrowed lids. "John Halleck," she said distinctly, "I don't propose to do anything of the kind. In the first place, they won't exchange things bought at a bargain sale, and in the second, if you aren't interested in the other world, I am. So there." And she slid down and walked from the room before I could think of a single thing to say. She walked very huffily. Well, it was like that all the rest of the evening. Just as soon as I mentioned Ouija boards, I felt things begin to cloud up, so I decided to let it go for the present, in the hope that she might be more reasonable later. After supper I had another try at the writing, but as my mind continued a perfect blank, I gave it up and went off to bed. The next day was Saturday, and it being near the end of the month and a particularly busy day, I left home early without seeing Lavinia. Understand, I haven't quite reached the point where I can give my whole time to writing, and being bookkeeper for a lumber company does help with the grocery bills and pay for Lavinia's fancy shopping. Friday had been a half-holiday, and of course when I got back the work was piled up pretty high, so high in fact that ghosts and stories and everything else vanished in a perfect tangle of figures. When I got off the streetcar that evening, my mind was still churning. I remember now that I noticed even from the corner how brightly the house was illuminated, but at the time that didn't mean anything to me. I recall as I went up the steps and opened the door, I murmured, 9 times 9 is 81. And then Gladolia met me in the hall. "Mr. Halleck, the missus sho thinks you's lost. She say she done phone you dis morning to be home early, but for the Lord's sake not to stop to argify now, but get ready for the company and come on down." Some memory of a message given me by one of the clerks filtered back through my brain, but I had been hunting 3 lost receipts at the time and had completely forgotten it. "Company?" I said stupidly. "What company?" "The missis's Ouija board party," said Gladolia, and rolling her eyes she disappeared in the direction of the kitchen. I must have gone upstairs and dressed and come down again, for I presently found myself standing in the dimly lighted lower hall, wearing my second-best suit and a fresh shirt and collar, but I have no recollections of the process. There was a great chattering coming from our little parlour, and I went over to the half-open door and peered through. The room was full of women, most of them elderly, whom I recognized as belonging to my wife's book club. They were sitting in couples, and between each couple was a Ouija board. The mournful squeak of the legs of the moving triangular things on which they rested their fingers filled the air and mixed in with the conversation. I looked around for the ghosts, with my heart sunk down to 0. What if Lavinia should see her and go mad before my eyes? And then my wife came and tapped me on the shoulder. "John," she said in her sweetest voice, and I noticed that her cheeks were very pink and her eyes were very bright. My wife is never so pretty as when she's doing something she knows I disapprove of. "John, dear, I know you'll help us out. Mrs. William Augustus Wainwright phoned at the last moment to say that she couldn't possibly come, and that leaves poor Laura Hinkle without a partner. Now, John, I know some people can work a Ouija by themselves, but Laura can't, and she'll just have a horrible time unless you—" "Me?" I gasped. "Me? I won't." But even as I spoke, she had taken my arm, and the next thing I knew I was sitting with the thing on my knees, and Miss Laura Hinkle opposite, grinning in my face like a flirtatious crocodile. I won't," I began. "Now, Mr. Halleck, don't you be shy." Miss Laura Hinkle leaned forward and shook a bony finger almost under my chin. I am not. Only I say I won't." "No, it's very easy, really. You just put the tips of your fingers right here beside the tips of my fingers." And the first thing I knew, she had taken my hands and was coyly holding them in the position desired. She released them presently, and the little board began to slide around in an aimless sort of way. There seemed to be some force tugging it about. I looked at my partner, first with suspicion, and then with a vast relief. If she was doing it, then all that talk about spirits— Oh, I did hope Miss Laura Hinkle was cheating with that board. "Ouija, dear, won't you tell us something?" she cooed, and on the instant the thing seemed to take life. It rushed to the upper left-hand corner of the board and hovered with its front leg on the word "Yes." Then it began to fly around so fast that I gave up any attempt to follow it. My companion was bending forward and had started to spell out loud. "Traitor. Traitor. Why, what does she mean?" "I don't know," I said desperately. My collar felt very tight. "But she must mean something. Ouija, dear, won't you explain yourself more fully?" "ASKHIM. Ask him. Ask who, Ouija?" I'm going," I choked, and tried to get up, but my fingers seemed stuck to that dreadful board, and I dropped back again. Apparently Miss Hinkle had not heard my protest. The thing was going around faster than ever, and she was reading the message silently, with her brow corrugated, and the light of the huntress in her pale blue eyes. "Why, she says it's you, Mr. Halleck. What does she mean?" "Ouija? Won't you tell us who was talking?" I groaned, but that inexorable board continued to spell. I always did hate a spelling match. Miss Hinkle was again following it out loud. Helen. Helen. She raised her voice until it could be heard at the other end of the room. "Lavinia, dear, do you know anyone by the name of Helen?" "By the name of... I can't hear you," and my wife made her way over to us between the book club chairs. "You know, the funniest thing has happened," she whispered excitedly. "Someone has been trying to communicate with John through Mrs. Hunt's and Mrs. Springle's Ouija. Someone by the name of Helen. Why, isn't that curious?" "What is?" Miss Hinkle simpered. "Someone giving the name of Helen has just been calling for your husband here." "But we don't know anyone by the name of Helen." Lavinia stopped and began to look at me through narrowed lids, much as she had done in the library the evening before. And then from different parts of the room other manipulators began to report. Every plagued one of those 5 Ouija boards was calling me by name. I felt my ears grow crimson, purple, maroon. My wife was looking at me as though I were some peculiar insect. The squeak of Ouija boards and the murmur of conversation rose louder and louder. And then I felt my face twitch in the spasm of that idiotic grin. I tried to straighten my wretched features into their usual semblance of humanity. I tried, and... "Doesn't he look sly?" said Miss Hinkle. And then I got up and fled from the room. I do not know how that party ended. I do not want to know. I went straight upstairs and undressed and crawled into bed and lay there in the burning dark, while the last guest gurgled in the hall below about the wonderful evening she had spent. I lay there while the front door shut after her, and Lavinia's steps came up the stairs, past the door to the guest room beyond. Then, after a couple of centuries elapsed, the clock struck 3, and I dozed off to sleep. At the breakfast table the next morning there was no sign of my wife. I concluded she was sleeping late. But Gladolia, upon being questioned, only shook her head, muttered something, and turned the whites of her eyes up to the ceiling. I was glad when the meal was over, and hurried to the library for another try at that story. I had hardly seated myself at the desk when there came a tap at the door, and a white slip of paper slid under it. I unfolded it and read, "Dear John, I am going back to my grandmother. My lawyer will communicate with you later." "Oh," I cried, "oh, I wish I was dead." And "That's exactly what you ought to be," said the horrible voice from the other end of the room. I sat up abruptly. I had sunk into a chair under the blow of the letter, and then I dropped back again, and my hair rose in a thick prickle on the top of my head. Coming majestically across the floor towards me was a highly polished pair of thick-laced shoes. I stared at them in a sort of dreadful fascination, and then something about their gait attracted my attention, and I recognized them. "See here," I said sternly, "what do you mean by appearing here like this?" "I can't help it," said the voice, which seemed to come from a point about 5½ feet above the shoes. I raised my eyes and presently distinguished her round, protruding mouth. "Why can't you? A nice way to act, to walk in sections." "If you'll give me time," said the mouth in an exasperated voice, "I assure you the rest of me will presently arrive." "But what's the matter with you? You never acted this way before." She seemed stung to make a violent effort, for a portion of a fishy eye and the end of her nose popped into view with a suddenness that made me jump. "It's all your fault," she glared at me, while part of her hair and her plaid skirt began slowly to take form. "My fault? Of course. How can you keep a lady up working all night and then expect her to retain all her faculties the next day? I'm just too tired to materialize." "Then why did you bother?" "Because I was sent to ask when your wife is going to get rid of that Ouija board." "How should I know? I wish to heaven I'd never seen you," I cried. "Look what you've done. You've lost me my wife. You've lost me my home and happiness. You've... "Mr. Halleck," came from the hall outside. "Mr. Halleck, I's gwine to quit. I don't like no hoodoos," and the steps retreated. You've lost me my cook." "I didn't come here to be abused," said the ghost coldly. I And then the door opened and Lavinia entered. She wore the brown hat and coat she usually travels in, and carried a suitcase, which she set down on the floor. That suitcase had an air of solid finality about it, and its lock leered at me brassily. I leaped from my chair with unaccustomed agility and sprang in front of my wife. I must conceal that awful phantom from her at any risk. She did not look at me or, thank heaven, behind me, but fixed her injured gaze upon the waste-basket as if to wrest dark secrets from it. "I have come to tell you that I am leaving," she staccatoed. "Oh, yes, yes," I agreed, flapping my arms about to attract attention from the corner. "That's fine, great. So you want me to go, do you?" she demanded. "Sure, yes, right away. Change of air will do you good. I'll join you presently." If only she would go till Helen could depart. I'd have the devil of a time explaining afterward, of course, but anything would be better than to have Lavinia see a ghost. Why, that sensitive little woman couldn't bear to have a mouse say boo at her, and what would she say to a ghost in her own living room? Lavinia cast a cold eye upon me. "You're acting very queerly," she sniffed. "You are concealing something from me." Just then the door opened, and Gladolia called, "Miss Halleck, Miss Halleck, I come to tell you I's done left this place." My wife turned her head a moment. "But why, Gladolia?" "I ain't stayin' round no place long with dem Ouija board contraptions. I's scared of hoodoos. I's done gone, I is." "Is that all you've got to complain about?" Lavinia inquired. "Yes, ma'am." "All right, then, go back to the kitchen. You can use the board for kindling wood." "Who? Me touch that thing? No, ma'am, not this nigger. I'll be the coon to burn it," I shouted. "I'll be glad to burn it." Gladolia's heavy step moved off kitchenward. Then my Lavinia turned waspishly to me again. "John, there's not a bit of use trying to deceive me. What is it you're trying to conceal from me?" "Who? Me? Oh, no," I lied elaborately, looking around to see if that dratted ghost was concealed enough. She was so big, and I'm rather a smallish man. But that was a bad move on my part. "John," Lavinia demanded like a ward boss, "you are hiding somebody in here. Who is it?" I only waved denial and gurgled in my throat. She went on, "It's bad enough to have you flirt over the Ouija board with that hussy." "Oh, the affair was quite above board, I assure you, my love," I cried, leaping lithely about to keep her from focusing her gaze behind me. She thrust me back with sudden muscle. "I will see who's behind you. Where is that Helen?" "Me, I'm Helen," came from the ghost. Lavinia looked at that apparition, that owl-eyed phantom in plaid skirt and stiff shirt-waist, with hair skewed back and no powder on her nose. I threw a protecting husbandly arm about her to catch her when she should faint. But she didn't swoon. A broad, satisfied smile spread over her face. "I thought you were Helen of Troy," she murmured. "I used to be Helen of Troy, New York," said the ghost, "and now I'll be moving along if you'll excuse me. See you later." With that she telescoped briskly, till we saw only a hand waving farewell. My Lavinia fell forgivingly into my arms. I kissed her once or twice fervently, and then I shoved her aside, for I felt a sudden strong desire to write. The sheets of paper on my desk spread invitingly before me. "I've got the bulliest plot for a ghost story," I cried. End of chapter 23.
Chapter 24 of Humorous Ghost Stories. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Chuck Williamson. Humorous Ghost Stories, selected by Dorothy Scarborough. Chapter 24. The Lady and the Ghost, by Rose Cecil O'Neill. It was some moments before the lady became rationally convinced that there was something occurring in the corner of the room, and then the actual nature of the thing was still far from clear. "To put it as mildly as possible," she murmured, "the thing verges upon the uncanny." And, leaning forward upon her silken knees, she attended upon the phenomenon. At first it had seemed like some faint and unexplained atmospheric derangement, occasioned, apparently, neither by an opened window nor by a door. Some papers fluttered to the floor, the fringes of the hangings softly waved, and indeed
it would still have been easy to dismiss the matter as the effect of a vagrant draught, had not the state of things suddenly grown unmistakably unusual. All the air of the room, it then appeared, rushed even with violence to the point, and there underwent what impressed her as an aerial convulsion, in the very midst and wellspring of which, so great was the confusion, there seemed to appear at intervals almost the semblance of a shape. The silence of the room was disturbed by a book that flew open with fluttering leaves, the noise of a vase of violets blown over, from which the perfumed water dripped to the floor, and soft touchings all around as of a breeze passing through a chamber full of trifles. The ringlets of the lady's hair were swept forward toward the corner, upon which her gaze was fixed, and in which the conditions had now grown so tense with imminent occurrence, and so rent with some inconceivable throe, that she involuntarily rose, and, stepping forward against the pressure of her petticoats, which were blown about her ankles, she impatiently thrust her hand into the... She was immediately aware that another hand had received it, though with a far from substantial envelopment, and for another moment what she saw before her trembled between something and nothing. Then from the precarious situation there slowly emerged into dubious view the shape of a young man, dressed in evening clothes over which was flung a mantle of voluminous folds, such as worn by ghosts of fashion. "The very deuce was in it," he complained. "I thought I should never materialize." She flung herself into her chair, confounded. Yet even in the shock of the emergency, true to herself, she did not fail to smooth her ruffled locks. Her visitor had been scanning his person in a dissatisfied way, and with some vexation he now ejaculated, "Beg your pardon, my dear, but are my feet on the floor, or where in thunder are they?" It was with a tone of reassurance that she confessed that his patent leathers were the trivial matter of 2 or 3 inches from the rug. Whereupon, with still another effort, he brought himself down until his feet rested decently upon the floor. It was only when he walked about to examine a bric-a-brac that a suspicious lightness was discernible in his tread. When he had composed himself by the survey, affecting it with an air of great insouciance, which, however, failed to conceal the fact that his heart was beating somewhat wildly, he approached the lady. "Well, here we are again, my love," he cried, and devoured her hands with ghostly kisses. "It seems an eternity that I've been struggling back to you through the outer void and what not. Sometimes, I confess, I all but despaired. Life is not, I assure you, all beer and skittles for the disembodied." He drew a long breath, and his gaze upon her and the entire chamber seemed to envelop all and cherish it. "Little room, and so you are thus. Do you know," he continued with vivacity, "I have wondered about it in the grave, and I could hardly sleep for this place unpenetrated. Hi-ho! What a lot of things we leave undone. I dashed this off at the time, the literary passion strong in me, thus. Now, when all is done, and I lie so low, I cannot sleep for this, my only care. For though of that dim place I could not know, that where my heart was fain I did not go, nor saw you musing there. Well, well, these things irk a ghost so. Naturally, as soon as possible I made my way back, to be satisfied that you were still mine. He bent a piercing look upon her. I observe by the calendar on your writing table that some years have elapsed since since I expired, he added with a faint blush. It appears that the matter of their dissolution is in conversation, rather kept in the background by well-bred ghosts. Hi-ho! How time does fly! You'll be joining me soon, my dear. She drew herself splendidly up, and he was aware of her beauty in the full of its tenacious excellence, of the delicate insolence of life looking upon death, of the fact that she had forgotten him. He rose and confronted this, his trembling hands thrust into his pockets, then turned away to hide the dismay of his countenance. He was, however, a spook of considerable spirit, and in a jiffy he met the occasion. To her blank, indignant gaze he drew a card from his case, and taking a pencil from the secretary, wrote beneath the name, "Quiet to the breast, wheresoever it be, that gave an hour's rest to the heart of me. Quiet to the breast, till it lieth dead, and the heart be clay, where I visited. Quiet to the breast, though forgetting quite, the guest is sheltered once, to the heart good night." Handing her the card, he bowed, and through force of habit turned to the door, forgetting that his ghostly pressure would not turn the knob. As the door did not open, with a sigh of recollection for his spiritual condition, he prepared to disappear, casting one last look at the faithless lady. She was still looking at the card in her hand, and the tears ran down her face. She has remembered, he reflected. How courteous. For a moment it seemed he could contain his disappointment, discreetly removing himself now at what he felt was the vanishing point, with the customary reticence of the dead, but feeling overcame him. In an instant he had her in his arms and was pouring out his love, his reproaches, the story of his longing, his doubts, his discontent, and his desperate journey back to earth for a sight of her. And, cried he, picture my agony at finding you had forgotten, and yet I surmised it in the gloom, I divined it by my restlessness and my despair. Perhaps some lines that occurred to me will suggest the thing to you. You recall my old knack for versification? Where the grasses weep o'er this darkling bed, and the glow-worms creep, lies the weary head of one laid deep who cannot sleep, the unremembered dead. He took a chair beside her and spoke of their old love for each other, of his fealty through all transmutations, incidentally of her beauty, of her cruelty, of the light of her face which had illuminated his darksome way to her, and of a lot of other things, and the lady bowed her head and wept. The hours of the night passed thus. The moon waned and a pallor began to tinge the dusky cheek of the east, but the eloquence of the visitor still flowed on, and the lady had his misty hand clasped to her reawakened bosom. At last a suspicion of rosiness touched the curtain. He abruptly rose. I cannot hold out against the morning, he said. It is time all good ghosts were in bed. But she threw herself on her knees before him, clasping his ethereal waist with a despairing embrace. "Oh, do not leave me," she cried, "or my love will kill me." He bent eagerly above her. "Say it again. Convince me." "I love you," she cried again and again and again, with such an anguish of sincerity as would convince the most skeptical spook that ever revisited the glimpses of the moon. "You will forget again," he said. "I shall never forget," she cried. "My life will henceforth be one continual remembrance of you, one long act of devotion to your memory, one oblation, one unceasing penitence, one agony of waiting." He lifted her face and saw that it was true. "Well," he said, gracefully wrapping his cloak about him. "Well, now I shall have a little peace." He kissed her with a certain jaunty grace upon her hair, and prepared to dissolve, while he lightly tapped a tattoo upon his leg with the dove-colored gloves he carried. "Good-bye, my dear," he said. "Henceforth I shall sleep o' nights. My heart is quite at rest." "But mine is breaking," she wailed, madly trying once more to clasp his vanishing form. He threw her a kiss from his misty fingertips, and all that remained with her, besides her broken heart, was a faint disturbance of the air. End of chapter 24. End of Humorous Ghost Stories, selected by Dorothy Scarborough.